Danielle Strachman and Harry Gandhi are investors at 1517, a venture capital fund dedicated to backing dropouts working on hard problems and sci-fi scientists at the earliest stages of their companies. I'm very proud to be partnered with 1517 for my biotech company, Ion. In our conversation, we talk about the archetype of 1517 founders, dynamics of fundraising, building successful deep tech startups, and much more. We'll get to that conversation in just a moment. First, I'd like to thank the supporters of this podcast. This conversation was recorded in Legacy Interviews Studio Lounge. Legacy Interviews is a company that video records individuals and couples sharing their life stories so that future generations can both see and hear the voices of their family. This conversation was produced by Noble Lore. Noble Lore is an agency that makes podcasting easy. You sit down, talk, and they take care of the rest. To check out either of these sponsors, see their links in the description of this interview. Now on to my conversation with Danielle and Harry. What does it mean for somebody to be high agency?
Wow. What does it mean for somebody to be high agency? Gosh, to me, I'm going to start with I think one definition, because I probably have multiple definitions of high agency, is someone who is directive about their future. And that could be in their work life, that could be their home life, that they have this sense of that they're not only are they steering the ship, but they're supposed to be steering the ship. That's what immediately comes to mind when I think of high agency, that can-do attitude, not waiting for somebody else to do something or offer them something that they're going to do it themselves.
The reason I ask is because I've heard you guys say before that you look for your founders to be people of high agency. Whenever you're interacting with people before you've made the commitment to work with them or to partner with them, what are the types of signals that you get from individuals that indicate that they're someone who's high agency?
To me, it just comes out in their storytelling when they talk about sort of a narrative of what they've done and what they've started building. And that often they had this idea or this sense of wonder about something and they just dived into it. We have a newer to us founder that we're working with who's 18, and he's working on extracting rare earth metals. And it's interesting because when I was in his office in San Francisco, he's up at the whiteboard and he's talking all about what he's doing and how he's doing it. And I was like, okay, hold on, back up. How did you even think of what you're doing? Let's really slow down a little bit. And he said, when I was 13, my parents kind of carved out a piece of the basement for me, or garage. It was a garage. And I started working on some ideas and I had no money and I had no equipment. And so I had to think about how could I do things with literally just having a corner of the garage. And to me, that's a great example of a high agency person. He really wanted to work in certain areas. He had this sense of fascination there. And then he had to use what he had to get there, which was nothing. And, now he has this office in San Francisco that he's just set up on his own. And like many a good scrappy founder, he's getting equipment from other founders and off of eBay and, beg borrowing and I don't think stealing, but just getting what he can to move further.
When someone like that who starts off really scrappy finds a group like you guys or a different group that sees that potential and then makes a multi-million-dollar bet on a person like that, what are the biggest hurdles that you see young people like that have to jump through to translate being young and scrappy with tens, if not less, maybe just thousands of dollars or whatever they're working with at the time, to then having all of the resources they ever thought that they would need and then having to go out and solve their mission with those?
I think the first feeling is oh my God, this is happening. Because usually these people have been thinking about this for such a long period of time. And now they have this, they've always had the energy, but now they also have the resources to go after their dream. So that's very humbling for them. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit before. And that's of course very freeing and liberating. but there's also this pressure that comes with it where it's like, oh my God, now I have to do the thing I said I was going to do. So, and of course, like, there's that pressure, but I think it's a good type of pressure. And these people are able to channel that pressure to like focus into whatever it is they're doing, you know, reach out to people in their network for help or continue building the thing that they are. And they really seize the moment. So yeah, I think it's there's two parts to it, but there's this energy that they use in a positive way. And that's amazing to see.
I'm going to add a secondary piece to this, which is sometimes we see this particular growth narrative of founders who are very used to being very scrappy. I love this. We actually have a new term for it at 1517 that we've been calling alchemy. It's like this ability of taking something that you have and it's almost like magic where you transform it into something else. And we have lots of teams who are really good at making this magic happen with very little in terms of funding and resources, especially, you know, as an early stage company and startup. But what we also see is that founders often need to learn how to utilize those larger resources and think about doing that alchemy, but maybe on a different scale. So an example of this is we have a couple founders, Danielle and Matthew from Saragen.
Yeah.
And their company out of Waterloo. Waterloo and Canadian founders are incredibly scrappy. They have to be. The venture ecosystem there is not as risk-taking as, you know, the U.S. and other places. It's getting there. It's growing.
Yeah.
And there's some good people there. But we started working with this team, and they are really, really good at this alchemy of like making the dollar stretch as far as they can. And at one point, we were on a review call with the team, and Danielle mentioned like, gosh, like, okay, we have this much runway. This is our burn. We want to hire a couple more people, but it's going to really bring, you know, things back a little bit, makes me a little nervous. But at some point, you also do need to learn how to spend those resources and do it in an aggressive way to get to the milestones you want to reach. And so one of the things we like to do at 1517 is something we sometimes call surprise attack, which is like we have a great call with the team. We're like, okay, they sound like things are going really awesome. They're a little strapped for cash. What about if we just offer them some more cash and, you know, we'll do a bump on the note, something like that. So we did this with Danielle and Matthew. And I remember, I think I could sort of almost like see the wheels turning in Danielle's head of like, oh, yeah, that's right. Like money does solve some problems, and like learning to utilize money in that way and to hire more team members and accelerate. Or we have another team where I remember the founders, you know, it's pretty common for founders to either take very low salary or sometimes no salary at the beginning. But these particular founders and they had a lot of runway actually. And I was like, and apparently they would fight sometimes about like, hey, should they get bagels on Friday for like the whole team? And I was like, guys, like and actually this is interesting. This is another brother sister team. We have a lot of sibling teams we work with. But I was like, it's okay. Buy the bagels. Like make your team happy. That's a good use of your spend. And you know, maybe it is time to take a little salary so, you know, you can like at least have somewhere where you can get a good night's sleep instead of crashing on your friend's couch or something like that. So there's these different learning curves of like being scrappy and resourceful, but also being resourceful with more resources and what that looks like.
Something that I didn't expect, like for context for people listening, like, right, I'm a portfolio company of you guys's. I remember during my orientation call with Harry, you were on it, and it was Michael and Zach, and you guys said something to the tune of, we've already counted your investment as a loss.
Yeah.
And any return that we get would be a pleasant surprise from here on out. So go with God, and you know.
We should say it like that. That'd be better.
Yeah, we're gonna use that line.
Well, there you go. It was very, I guess, liberating to hear, and I guess I still think about that a little bit of like how to exit the desire to bootstrap mindset and think bigger. As you guys are working with first-time founders. that are people of high agency, what are the types of things that whenever you have those check-in calls and you're asking people how things are going and what types of things they need help with, the type of thing that people don't know to ask for help on, but that if they did, they would get a lot of additional leverage as they're just getting started. So a place where founders need help that because they don't have the experience yet, they don't even know to ask for it.
Yeah, I'll go at this from the Johari window. So, this concept of unknown unknowns, known unknowns, and then known knowns. Founders are typically great at the third portion where it's like, I know I got to do this. Here's how I'm going to do it. It's just a matter of execution. Then there's the second category of problem, which is like, I know this is a problem. I don't know how to solve for it, and that's why I'm bringing it up. The hardest one is the first one, which is, I don't know if this problem exists. And I mean, we don't have all the answers, but in general, it is that first category of unknown unknowns that is typically the toughest for them to ask about. And one of the things, I mean, lucky for us, I mean, I've been doing it far less than Danielle has, but Danielle has been doing this for more than a decade now. So she knows this conversion between unknown unknowns and known unknowns that keep on popping up over and over again. We were just talking about some common tropes and milestones that our founders would hit or people in our community would hit. And they send us pictures when they're first, anywhere from a first child that they've had all the way through, a first hire or like a first customer. So one of the things in these like checkup calls, we try to really get to know them as people. That's first and foremost most important. And usually when things are going, they'll start telling us about their personal lives, and then it will get into business if it even gets to that. But to us, there's this harmony between the personal and the business. So that makes it really easy to wrap our minds around, this transition of known knowns to unknown unknowns.
And yeah, one thing I'll add to that too is there's multiple ways that we spend time with the people in our community, whether that's people who come to dinners and are part of the broader 1517 community, or founders that we work with where they're more specific to the portfolio. And one is in this review context where we might be going over, yep, how, we always kick off with, yeah, how are you doing? Like, what's a high level update? Like, but let's start with you. And obviously gets into, the business angles. And I think we're good at thinking about what we've seen from a pattern recognition side of things. Like I was talking to a founder recently, and he's getting into his first set of pilots with customers. And one thing that, we got to learn with a lot of our Fund One portfolio founders was, what does it take to have a good pilot, and how do you measure that? And how do you measure the value, not just in terms of like the first order consequence of your pilot with a customer, but the second and third order consequences and how you might put a dollar amount to that. And so I was talking to this founder about, have you started thinking about these second order and third order consequences? Because usually people undervalue what they're doing and what they're selling. And he's like, oh, this is really good. And he's writing stuff down. So a lot of it is like narrative storytelling and sharing like what we've seen and trying to pull that out. But there's a second piece that Harry was actually getting at that I think is really important, which is that we spent lots of unstructured time with people.
Right.
And what's interesting is that like we didn't like engineer that at 1517. Like Michael and I didn't start the firm and say, okay, we're going to spend unstructured time with people. Like it's this funny thing that we're in our 10th year of operation now, and it's starting to emerge as, oh yeah, this is one of the super important things we do, because it gives us more insight into the humans that we work with and what some of those unknown unknowns might be and who they are as people. And it might look like having dinner as a group. It might look like having dinner at one of our homes. I have I'm just going to throw it out there. Augustus from Rainmaker was at my house having dinner, and we were having this like great chat, and we must have talked business for an hour. And then at the end of like the business chat portion of dinner, he's like, all right, Danielle, let's talk about dating. Can we go there? And I was like, yes, Like, let's go. And so now when I, check in, we'll talk about business stuff, or, I'll see something of his on Twitter. I'm like, hey, how's that dating side going? Like, let me know. So I think there's something that we're able to get at in some of these unknown unknowns through that unstructured time. And I think it's something that is really special for us because we get to just really meet people as who they are and where they're at. But it's also become this like sort of strange advantage of the fund of like, oh yeah, like lots of fund managers and investors aren't spending unstructured time with the people they work with, and they're not building communities. And it's becoming a sort of like, it just has this virtuous cycle advantage to it that we only started really articulating in the last few months of like, oh yeah, this piece of it seems really important. And, some of our team have gone on road trips with founders, and it's like you're sitting in the car for many hours and you're on the road. And it's just a different way of being with people.
There's only so much business to talk about.
Oh, yeah.
And
it's also only like it's such a small fraction of who somebody is.
Yeah.
It's not really who they are. Like one of our founders was saying, this young woman, Olivia, that we were the only group that asked her about why she was building what she was building. And I was like, what? To me, that's like the most important thing. Like, I don't I care about the market size, but like, that's like, I don't know, half hour into the conversation especially on a first conversation.
Yeah.
I want to know why someone's going to, want to talk about this on a road trip for so long.
Mm-hmm.
It's why the traditional pitch, I don't think, works. Because there's the structure, you're meeting effectively a salesperson. And getting to know people for who they really are is, to me, to all of us, the most important thing. And this unstructured playtime is one of the many ways that we're able to see people. And quite frankly, it's true from the other side also. A lot of people reach out to us, not for the money, but they're just like, hey, I'm working on this project. I'd love feedback. And they'll say it that way. But sometimes, and quite oftentimes, they're looking for a social permission almost, where it's like, if you believe in this and that you don't think I'm crazy, I'll go out and do this. And in 99 out of 100 times, we're like, yeah, let's see you do it.
Right. Give it a shot. Why not?
Yeah.
A year before I got my investment from you guys, Harry came all the way down to St. Louis from Toronto, and I had we were just talking about this before, and it was Haya Gross put me in touch with you. Then I think you put me in touch with Harry because Harry is more on the science side. And then you and I maybe chatted once or twice on Zoom, and you were like, "Sounds like something's going on down there. Let me come." We were doing a conference here, and I invited you to that, and that was its own fun thing.
Yeah.
But you came by my place before even getting started, and that was again, a year before partnering with you guys, and the fact that one of you was willing to come to the city and there was no, I don't think that we were having any type of conversation. I didn't have any type of business model. I was just trying to figure out how to do wet lab science, and you had been involved in, because that's what you were doing. You were building a database of other places where there are community labs because that's a big bottleneck for people like me before you get started and you don't have the money. Reagents and stuff are expensive, but they're not that expensive. Like if you have just enough disposable income, the biggest hurdle I think for a biotech founder to getting started is that it can take tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment to get off the ground. Other than the obvious ways of like buying secondhand equipment on Craigslists and government auctions and stuff like that, what are the ways that you guys have seen founders in that space specifically be scrappy and find opportunities to interface with places to do their work in lieu of being able to buy all those things?
Oh God, there's so many ways now. It's in the same way that cost of computing has gone down and it made software development easy across the 2010s, or even before then. Something similar is going on with at least specific types of biology and specific types of chemistry. Like, for example, there's something called the Odin kit you can buy and just do a bunch of synthetic biology that would be unfathomable without a lab a decade or a decade and a half ago. There's all these gene databases that have been created where other people have data that you can use to do your, obscure gene editing tool that you want to build. So there's a lot of these infrastructure things that have been decentralized, which should give, the builder in the garage or in your bedroom, what have you, the power to do a lot of very interesting science without actually spending all that much money. The other thing that's been going on, and one of the things in creating that lab list, I figured out, there are tons of community labs that are popping up. Originally, I just created the tool based on, the database based on what I saw in the labs I had visited. But as soon as I put it out there, people started messaging me. It's like, oh my God, we have this lab space. I would love for you to add it to the list. Or one of these builder type people would come to us and are like, hey, worked out of this lab. You should add that also. And then it grew. It was originally just a North American thing. Now we even have some European labs in there also. So there's definitely some momentum to this decentralization of science, and everyone having at least some access to it. The other rate limiting factor for these, renegade scientists, we like to call them, is a sense of community. And there's this thing called the ignorance tax. You can easily make mistakes, make a relatively avoidable mistake just because you might not know a particular subset of science. And I think that can be solved by community, and finding other people who are doing similar things is a really easy way to offset this ignorance tax. I mean, with some of the stuff you're doing with St. Louis and the lab that you've gathered and the mini community you've gathered is a great example of that. And I think more people out to do this in more places.
Yeah, RJ definitely helps me overcome a lot of my ignorance. I would, when I'm asked like the biggest two things that I underestimated since getting started as a founder, having been like funded and at it for about a half a year now, is both how slow biology actually is.
Right.
That's a huge rate limiting factor. Like our iteration cycle is, 2 to 4 weeks for any given like iteration of a thing, A, and then B, a little bit to what you're getting at with having a community of people to get this type of feedback is how little information that's out there can be taken at face value.
Right.
Right. And you do have to have conversations with people where it's like, if there's a protocol in a paper and you take that protocol and you run it and it doesn't work, you're like, I guess I'll run it again. It still didn't work. I guess I'll reach out to the author. And the author's like, oh, there's all of these little things that I didn't put in there because it would have been obvious or whatever. But actually, you need to use this specific media, or it needs to be this temperature in the room whenever you run this.
Oh, wow.
Or like, this is the type of plate that we used for the cells because the adherent that's at the bottom for the cells to fix to is a specific type, and it works with these plates and it doesn't work with these plates. It is very, very hard to come up to your point with the ignorance taxes, I guess what I'm going off of. That can be hard to overcome if you don't have people who, like say I brought up RJ. RJ, for context, is a guy who worked at a research organization for long enough to have ran through a lot of those types of things. And so it's helpful for me, for someone who was more on like the computational and concept side, to have someone like that to draw on that information from.
Yeah. Well, the traditional academic institution, the academic research institution, optimizes for publication.
Yeah.
So the currency of academic research is ideas, whereas the currency of startups is execution. And this is why the two don't easily translate over. And typically the renegade scientists that we find, they care far more about execution than they care about the idea. And as a result, they're able to rapidly iterate through it. And the good ones will look at a paper and are like, yeah, there's a bunch of things missing here, and I need to reach out to the author or the lab that conducted this work. And that's hard to learn without the school of hard knocks, unfortunately.
How do you assess good taste in founders? Because that's what I'm hearing you describe as having good taste for. ideas or the ways that things are done, to be able to, I don't know, have a low idiot index, or not the idiot index, the ignorance tax.
Gosh, there's probably a lot to say about taste. Um, I'm trying to think with our founders, like, I mean, yeah, it feel that the statement you had of picking people who have sort of good taste in this particular way feels intuitively right. But for me, in this particular moment, it's kind of hard to define. Like, what does that mean or look like?
Because that's what it is intuition, a little bit, right?
Boom.
Well played. Well played, Ben.
We played this game in the lab one day because we were like, I don't know, just had downtime, and we do like our weekly standings and whatnot, and we have our whiteboards there, and we were like, okay, what percentage? And we were frustrated by one of these types of situations of like things not working, right? And we'd gotten past it, but we're like, okay, let's play the game of how much of the existing work that's out there, for us to, because we're having to design experiments that have never been done before, in order to try things that there's no canonical answer for. And in order to do that, we need to look at all of the different ways that all different types of people are doing all different types of things, to pick and pull pieces in order to like factor together a protocol for what might work to answer our question. And so when doing that, the question that we asked during this thought experiment was, what percentage of all of the work that's out there for us to draw these pieces from do we think is bullshit? And the answer that we came to candidly was like 98%.
Wow.
Whereby the categories of bullshit are, probably biggest category is, does this work matter at all? Is the world different because we know the answer to this question? Another category is like misinterpreting the results, like p-hacking, if like we're familiar with these terms and these sorts of things. And by the end of it, going back to the idea of taste, that's where we landed at the end of that conversation. We were like, okay, so it is of utmost importance for us to be taste maxing, but what does it look like for us to have good taste in developing heuristics in science? We don't have answers yet, but we're continuing to iterate to try to develop what that taste is.
Well, it's a wicked problem. And I mean that in
I wanted you to explain this concept today.
Yeah, so this is a heuristic I've been using a lot as of late. So there's two categories of problems and by which I think about. One is called the tame problem, which is when you're trying to solve a problem, you'll get feedback. And in tame problems, the feedback is accurate, it's complete, and it's timely. So an example would be like playing a game of chess. Now I can quickly, once I've played a game of chess, I can quickly go up to the engine and see what moves I made right, wrong, what I could have done better. So it's timely, it's accurate. And as a result, I can learn very, very quickly how to get better. And publications were supposed to be this. It was supposed to make something that's inherently wicked tame. But a wicked problem is just the opposite. The feedback is not timely. It is incomplete, or you don't even know if it's incomplete, which is slightly worse, or it's inaccurate. And as a result, you cannot rely on this complete information system. And the way you approach that problem isn't purely rational anymore. You have to apply what you're calling taste or intuition to then navigate your way through this problem. And science, quite frankly, science has a lot of this, and I think there's probably bad engineers and scientists. Maybe bad is too strong. Maybe just they're more focused on solving 1 to 100 problems, whereas these 0 to 1 problems typically have this wicked nature to it, where you need a particular type of intuition to solve it, to figure that one out.
Do either of you guys read Eric Hoel's blog, The Intrinsic Perspective?
No, I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, neither have I.
Eric Hoel, the skyhook Eric Hoel in brevity, is actually how I came across Michael Levin's work, because Eric Hoel was up in the Integrated Information Theory Lab, which is kind of like the string theory of consciousness research in the academic space. And he came up with a framework that he more or less thought was mutually exclusive to what was being worked on there. And so he left. he started a Substack and he's writing there for a little bit. He actually wrote a fiction book called The Revelations that's like a scientific, thriller. It's really good. I'd recommend checking it out. And then he gets hired by this random developmental biology lab at Tufts University. And so I'm like, why'd this developmental biology lab hire this theoretical neuroscientist, information theorist? But going back to, so Eric he worked there for a couple years and has since gone full time on his blog. But he wrote a blog a couple weeks ago that I don't remember the exact name of, but his point was basically that the best scientists in history were guided by beautiful outcomes.
Yeah.
They were maximizing for beauty. And I don't know, I think that's an interesting heuristic when thinking and talking about taste, because there's another guy, Ken Wilber, who wrote a book, and he talks about a concept of aperspectival madness, where like you might be able to infer what that means from hearing it, right? Where it's sort of like you're in the postmodern bubble and you're like, oh my gosh, everything could be true, but I don't have a heuristic for picking what is true. And his heuristic from that book is kind of what Eric is getting at in this blog, is that whenever you're in that situation where you have many different possible paths and you don't have good rational frameworks within which to pick which path is best, you should pick which one is most beautiful.
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot to unpack here. And I love that you went there. I think relativism has done probably the biggest disservice to the advancement of science. Relativism meaning this idea that, anything is relative, any opinion matters. And as a result, I was reading this publication. Wasn't reading it. I just read the abstract, actually, where it's like, they were looking at the effect of cocaine in a Japanese quail. And the conclusion that they draw from this publication or from the study is, they're more excited afterwards. And it's like,
that's in the bullshit doesn't matter category.
Exactly. Is this the science that we really want? Like, but then a relativist would go in and say, who's to say that this study is not as valuable compared to unifying quantum mechanics with special relativity?
Yeah.
But these are the types of arguments the relativist would have. And I think that's given this odd form of protection to bullshit science.
Yeah.
And I think we have to do better than that.
One thing that comes to mind around this conversation, and I love the essence of sort of beauty maxing, if you will, of like, okay, doing something for this higher calling or purpose or a muse. And I'm sort of rethinking a question that we often ask founders, which is, what do you want to make absurd? So that's a question we often pull out. And we did this in the old Thiel Fellowship days all the way through now. And it's interesting because I do think like our team, where we vibe is when that person's answer to what do you want to make absurd has that beautiful angle to it of like, oh, wow, wasn't it crazy that, I don't know, we didn't sort of allow the future to flourish in certain ways is kind of at a meta level, I think, where a lot of that, what do you want to make absurd question gets at. But you're making me think about it in a different way right now. And I'm sort of curious where that will take us at 15, 17 of like, because I think a lot of people we work with, another word that's coming up in my mind is passion. Like there's this deep passion they have in an area. And then on the experimental side, that's where they come up with these questions. I used to work a lot with homeschoolers, and in a school I started called Innovations Academy, we have something called the essential question, which is that in the classroom, people are looking at questions that don't just have a right or wrong answer, but are bigger than that. And I think our founders often are answering these essential questions of, what's going to happen when I try to bring this thing to fruition. And yeah, I think a lot of them, because it comes from this place of passion instead of logic, I think it naturally has that beauty angle to it of like, this is going to add an element to the universe that wasn't previously there.
I want to ask you a question, Danielle.
Shoot, Harry.
Have you seen, okay, forget the founder label, but any of these incredible people you've worked with find beauty without the passion? Like, are both always present? Do they go hand in hand, or can they be teased out?
Can they find beauty without the passion?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this must happen all the time for people where they stumble into something and they're struck. There's like a being awestruck moment
Right.
of like, you weren't looking for it, but wow, this thing hit you in the face. And then it probably brings up about this passion to go deep down a rabbit hole on something. So yeah, I would assume that's true. But I think a lot of the people we do work with, I mean, I think it's probably this like, I want to say there's like this motion that happens of like, okay, maybe they get struck with something that opens up that awe moment of like, oh, this thing's really interesting and cool. And that engages them to go deeper, which engages them to have more insight, which engages them to go deeper. And it just keeps going. And I don't know if you have to have one, it's like a chicken and the egg of like, do you have to have one first? I don't think so, but I think they engage each other.
Yeah. So you're saying it's like a cascade.
Yeah.
Like
yeah,
there's
that's a good
this
word for it.
aha moment, which leads them to trigger for them to work on it, which leads to more aha moment.
Mm-hmm.
And the virtual cycle of this cascade then continues.
Mm-hmm. And one thing too is that I think sometimes that like I think it's easy to think these aha moments have to be these like really big grandiose moments or things. But I think like part of what a lot of the people we work with have retained is playfulness. And so I think a lot of it is like, oh, I was just like playing with this thing or this idea. And then this thing popped out of it. Neat. Like, let's go further with that. So I don't even think it has to be this like aha or eureka moment so much as like this person just had this like playfulness about it and just kept following it.
Right. This brings me to another point also, which is I think too many people want to be startup founders, like they're chasing the label of startup founder. A lot of times, at least I'm finding myself saying, that's cool. Like, that's a cool project. Let's tinker around with that project and see where it goes. I mean, actually, this is a similar example to you. When I first came to St. Louis and the first couple of times we met, like, you were just
bumbling around,
figuring things out. You were going to CROs and working at CROs and so on. So it was fascinating to see you in project mode. And then when you like, oh my God, there's something bigger here. We've just proven out some critical juncture of science. Then, and even then, sometimes it's not the right to go down the startup path. But then at least that becomes an option. Whereas the opposite way is like, I want to be a startup founder. This is a startup. And it as a result creates this undue pressure of like, I just need to make progress. And it takes, to Danielle's point, that playfulness out of it.
I'm very into this concept of play. And yesterday I met with a previous founder who wound down his last founder. You guys will actually meet him at dinner tomorrow. And we were talking about this because he's trying to figure out the next thing to do for himself. And he's never been the person who started the startup. He's always been like the first, like a founding engineer. And then kind of like phased out as the thing grew or whatever. He's 20 and he's one of the smartest young people that I've ever met in my life. Eli, I'd shout him out on the podcast. Like, he doesn't need to be kept hidden, but he was like, yeah, I need to pick the next thing to work on. And I want the next thing I work on to be for me, but I need to think about what that's going to be. And like, that was sort of what we landed on, is like, I don't know if you can just pick a thing. I was like, I think you need to go get like a cabin in the woods and play some video games or go on a hike and do whatever play looks like for you. How do you guys encourage, if at all, like if a founder is in like mindset mode and they're like, I gotta go and I gotta churn on the stone block or whatever to make progress, but like they're not quite creating leverage in exchange for their effort, what are the types of ways that you can subtly encourage them, or maybe not subtly, be like, you got to chill out and figure out what play is to you again? How do you communicate that to somebody?
We've tried this, and interesting story that comes to mind is the team at Lambda Labs, Stephen and Michael, another brother team. We love our siblings. And Lambda Labs originally started as, it actually started originally as like many other iterations of different projects. It was, to come back to this like play mode, like people talk about sandboxes a lot in play. And it's like sometimes you create a sandbox for yourself that you do your play in. And I think Stephen and Michael had created this C Corp 12 years ago. And, that's what Lambda Labs is. And it's just been their playground and their sandbox for creating all kinds of different things. And one iteration of this was starting something called Dreamscope, which was originally a photo sharing app. And this is, pre all these Instagram filters and things like this, where it's like, hey, you've got a Picasso in your face and you put them together and you've got yourself as a Picasso. And when myself and Michael met with Stephen, we just, Stephen and Michael, we just knew like, gosh, they're amazing people and we love working with them. And Stephen had been a mentor in the fellowship program. And so we had some of that unstructured time with him. So we got to know him really well. But it wasn't going well. They had raised too much money. They had a really big sandbox. And there wasn't necessarily pressure to get creative, because sometimes when you have too much money, it can also make things a bit stagnant. And I remember going to their apartment in Palo Alto. And it was like, okay, things had kind of just flatlined as far as growth on what they were doing. There was another company that came out of the woodwork called Prisma that just like took off, and their algorithm wasn't as good, but they had way better marketing than our guys did. So they took off, and our team was kind of left in the dust. And I remember Michael and I would go and talk to the team and be like, guys, time to think some new ideas. And, maybe it is time. And like, we would say like, maybe it's time to go get a cabin in the woods and like go hang out and, I don't know, try some new things and just, I don't know, free up your mind a bit from where you're at. And they didn't really take the coaching on this, actually. They were just in that grind mode. And it was interesting because we, for, the next follow-up review, I don't know, 8 weeks later, whenever that was, we were picking up our colleague Nick Arnett from the airport. And we pick him up at the airport, we're driving down to Palo Alto, and we're telling him this team is dead. Like this is, they're like a zombie team. And sometimes we crassly call this VC welfare, where it's like they have all this money, they can just eke off like a simple salary for a really long time and live in this apartment, and they're like gonna think they're fine, but they're dead. And we get there and the door opens and there's computer towers everywhere and bubble wrap everywhere and boxes. And I was like, Stephen, are you starting a computer company? Which is one thing that Lambda Labs, has sold for years at this point. And he's like, yeah, we're starting a computer company. And I was like, wow, I'm so glad we're here for the review so we can learn how this happened in this big pivot. But it was interesting to see that happen. And, and they did just have this aha moment one day of, hey, to build what we've been building, we had to make a deep learning workstation. And so the aha moment was, we have a second one collecting dust in the corner. Can we just put up a dummy landing page and see if we can sell this? And, going back to that sort of playful sandbox, it's like they went back to the sandbox. Maybe they didn't go as far as we thought of, like, okay, you need a break and you need to get out of here. But somehow they made their way back to the sandbox of like, hey, let's just try to put this thing online and see what happens. And they sold it in 24 hours. And that started the new, Lambda Labs. And of course it has grown to what it is today. But yeah, I think that particular team is really good at coming back to the sandbox and thinking about like, okay, what do we do now? How do we experiment? Kind of leaving aside what we think the road we think we're supposed to be traveling on.
What is the biggest company, even if it's not a portfolio of you guys' company, that you see is able to have that go back to the sandbox and build something entirely new behavior?
I think I have to think about that some more. I think there's lots of companies that try to build sandboxes. It's like you think about when Google used to have 20% time or Google X and things like that. And like the sad part is that, as you build a company, you do become responsible for, okay, this is the revenue driver. This is what we do. And this is what's taking us forward. And you can have these like side sandboxes, but at the end of the day, it's like, I don't know, the thing that is the beach is way larger than this little nice box you've carved out. But I'm sure there's like companies that we can think of that are actually good at this, but
well, this is the innovator's dilemma, is when you get to a certain point, it becomes all about scaling, and that's our focus. Like, we've done X works, let's find a way to get to X squared, or more. And that does this, that process of scaling does this weird thing where you try deciphering it, understanding it, and trying to make it into this science. Whereas a lot of playfulness is about art, where it's like, you're just trying out new things. It could be going into the cabin or whatever a founder wants to do. And it's very, very hard to create that space. So it's hard for companies to do that, but I think it's very easy. And actually, it's the role of communities to do that, is to create that space. So yeah, I don't know if companies can actually create that and do it over and over and over again. And quite frankly, I don't think it's their job.
I want to hear your reaction to this quote, Harry. I can't remember who to attribute it to, unfortunately, but it's art and science are only separated by strategy.
Yeah.
Is that a silly aphorism, or is it true?
Totally into it.
Totally into it. Great. Me too.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm very pro that quote.
Cool.
I think ultimately science and art are just different strategies to get to the truth. And unmasking. Yeah, just unmasking then by truth, it can mean the natural world. But it can also mean some deep reality about like what we are as humans. Or, you know, how the brain works, why things are the way they are, how do societies form. Like, to me, you can apply economics to study how societies work. You can also apply various forms of culture to understand how these communities also work. But they're two very different strategies. One applies more or less the scientific method, and that's a strategy, whereas art is applying a different strategy, and it's probably broader in the type of strategies that it ends up applying.
You guys, I've heard you describe 1517 as sort of your hammer, or VC is your hammer for shorting the higher education system. And kind of inherently by doing that through venture capital, like you have to, I bring this up because you were talking about scale, like to do venture capital as a means of shorting that system, you have to invest in things that are going to scale. What are some of the types of things that are also a sort of short on the paper belt or the higher education system that don't scale, that you guys think would be other things that should exist, but that are outside of 1517's purview because they're not venture backable companies?
Sure. I have a particular project that I would like to do that's in the art realm of, we've seen a lot of what Harry mentioned earlier about giving people permission, sometimes just through talking to people, to go off and do something. But we've also seen this too, where with our grant program we have called the Medici Project, sometimes we'll just kick people $1,000 to work on something. You know, we don't own them, we don't own their stuff. And those have turned out really wonderful. And I think there's something where it's not just a group giving accolades to a young person and saying, oh yeah, this is really awesome, you should go do it. It's actually giving them resources to do it. And we love doing that. We love doing that in this like R&D, hardware, bio, deep tech, like teenagers working on stuff, getting their hands really dirty. And I have like a sort of like a side thing where, and I've been talking about it for a couple of years at this point, where I'm like, I just gotta do it one of these days. But I want to do the same thing, but for young artists, you know, who are non-degreed, who are outside the institution, and be like, yeah, I'm going to give you $1,000 I actually I've been talking to young artists, and I was talking to this young woman who's a painter who already had taken a gap year and she's in school right now. And I just, this is a few months ago. I was like, what would you do with $1,000? She's like, canvases are just really expensive. It costs like, if I want to do a large scale piece, it costs $500 just for the canvas. I was like, oh my God. Wow. Okay. So giving people it back to that alchemy concept, like resources, and seeing how hard can they stretch that, but in like the painting world, I think would be really interesting. And I'd be really curious what the long tail of that would be, of like, is there something where people get started where they wouldn't have typically gotten started on something, or like maybe they start developing their ideas and new mediums that they want to work in, because they just have the freedom to do so. And $1,000 is not a huge amount of capital, but it's a lot to a young person who hasn't been sort of granted things before. And we love to be that first person to say, yeah, like go do it. And here's a little cash to get you started. So I would love to do more experimentation in that realm. It's outside of the official 1517 purview, but sometimes we've talked about at some point, do we have like 1517 family office? And it's like, okay, cool. We've got this larger structure with more money in it. And we're able to fund all kinds of things, both on like the venture side, but also like art and philanthropy and things like that.
I hope you do that. What it makes me think of as I hear you describe that is Rory Sutherland was on Rick Rubin's podcast recently, and one of my favorite startup books is his book Alchemy. It's got all sorts of useful models in there. But Rory likes to find what are the hidden things that actually catalyzed a movement.
Oh, sure.
Or like a wave of something.
Yep.
And so in this podcast with Rick, he's talking about how in the United Kingdom, around the time that like the Beatles and some of these other bands during like that 70s Cambrian explosion came about, he's like, it was oddly close to a like regulation that was passed, basically saying that if you started a business, you would get more what's the word, like not severance, but support basically from the government, like whatever.
Oh, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Whatever, your weekly unemployment check or something like that. That they passed a regulation that was like, if like, let's say you get $200 a week by default from the United Kingdom, if you're employed, if you had a business entity at all that existed, you would get like $250 or $300 a week. And so what he says is, he was like, what ended up happening is you had a lot of artists that would otherwise not have started a business, because they're artists, not business people, that were like, oh, I can get $50 more a week if I just have a business. And this put an artificial constraint on them to force them to have to solve certain types of problems and overcome challenges that they would not have otherwise had to, such as, filing taxes and whatever. And that might have helped make many of these bands more successful. And so, and you guys would not have even, is it fair to say you would not have started 1517 if not for having looked back on the success of the Thiel Fellowship? And because I read Michael's book, and the way that he describes it, right, is that you looked back and you were like, oh, if each of these $100,000 grants that we gave was a 5% investment in any of the companies that were successful, you'd be the best performing fund out there.
Yeah.
And
no, that's absolutely right. And in fact, Michael has very good taste and intuition. And in year 2 of the Thiel Fellowship, which includes Ritesh from Oyo Rooms and Dylan Field, and that's Figma, and Vitalik with Ethereum, and like just some of the greats. He was like, hey, we should set up some angel vehicle. And I was like, we don't have any clue how this would go. Like, I don't know. Like, and we talked about it. We even set up some dinners with people who were angel investors to like see if we should set up this vehicle. And 5 years in, it was like, oh, we definitely should have set up that vehicle. That would have been amazing. But it was 5 years in that we saw the outcome. And at that point, for me, I was like, okay, well, we should definitely go do this. Like this now really makes sense that we do know what we're doing. And even though we've not worked in another venture fund or something like that, we think the work we're doing is analogous enough, and that, a big part of being an early stage investor is, finding talent and thinking about things like taste. And And that made us take the leap. But yeah, I wish I had followed Michael's gut instinct in that second year and been like, yeah, we should definitely have this angel vehicle set up as a test run. But we didn't do it at that point.
I think the other thing that you and Michael did that was fascinating is you focused so much on building community.
Oh, yeah.
So it's one of these things that, I know the word community gets thrown around a lot, but what you built through the Thiel Fellowship could only hit 20 people a year.
That's right.
Whereas what you're doing with 1517 can hit a lot more people. And then vicariously, whether it be via the $1,000 grant, whether it be via the investments, and then broadly now, and I don't know if this is true when you were doing the Thiel Fellowship, but now a lot of people reach out to 1517 just asking for advice, asking for permission, who are just tinkering around in anywhere from their basement, or they might even have a lab space. Just like, how do I take this project to the next stage? I wonder if it wasn't for that community aspect that you had bet on so early on, whether we would have hit so many people.
Yeah. I think that at my heart, I'm a community builder. That's what I love to do and have sort of naturally done it forever. And so as community building became a thing, I was like, oh, there's a thing there. Like, this is called something. It's not just like getting people together over good food or something like that. I'll never forget when I was in my first job in a neurology department, and I was having a Christmas party at my little apartment outside of Boston. And I invited the people in the neurology department, a lot of grad students who were really cool. And I was younger than all of them. I was an undergrad and I trained all of them up. So it was like, had this kind of fun gravitas of like, oh, I trained you, but you're like more advanced than me. I invited my high school friends. I invited my Boston Objectivist Network friends who were ranging in age from like 18 to I'd say maybe 40. There's a group of about, I don't know, a core group of like 15 of us who are still friends today. And I was talking to a friend of mine in high school, and I had invited her to this Christmas party, and she's like, I can't believe what you're doing. This is completely ridiculous. I would never invite my work friends with my college friends, my high school friends, my philosophy objectivist group friends. And I was like, oh, why not? Like, they're just good, interesting people. And I'll never forget having this guy from the neurology department who had been a literal tiger trainer talking to one of my Boston Objectivist Network friends just about his work and what he had done in the literal circus. And they're just having a great time. And I was like, yeah, this is what mixing groups is all about. So I've always loved doing that. And when we were at the Thiel Foundation, I was part of lots of different sort of maker builder communities. Like, there used to be this conference called Bill. It was riffing off of Ted. And Bill and Ted, if you're from my generation, is classic movie lore. But Bill was about getting sort of the renegade people together who certainly could not afford to go to TED and certainly did not have the gravitas of attending TED, but we would locate the conference near TED at the same time on the same weekend. And I say this as a community member. I was not a lead for Bill. Friends were leads of Bill, but it was so cool to see that happening. And I had a friend who I was talking to her about the Thiel Fellowship, and I was telling her how our finalist events are so much fun. And we get these young people together and they say these things like, wow, I've never gotten to meet another young person like me before. And I remember being thrown by that statement. I was like, what do you mean? Like, I'm thinking they're thinking like smart, motivated, something like that. They're like, no one on my campus is doing things to just do them. They're doing them for a grade or like a reason. There's like rationale. They're not doing it, they're doing it to like ascend an escalator. They're not doing it because this is something they're really passionate about or that they've been diving into for years at this point. I was like, that's interesting. And my friend had this great insight. She was like, oh, why don't you do that for the applicant pool? And I was like, oh my God, genius. Like, of course. So we sent out an invite to people who had made it past like, the 50% cut in our applicant pool. And at the time, our applicant pool first year was 400 people. I think second year was maybe almost 1,000. So we sent this invite out to, I don't know, a few hundred people at least. And we held our first event at this high school. And we told people like, hey, you're going to get to come and meet other applicants. It was based off the Bill conference because the Bill conference is an unconference. And so I love this idea of just throwing out to the community, hey, come to this thing. You can give talks to each other. You can work with each other on things. We'll have some mentors there and you can sign up for office hours. We'll have a couple speakers as the like, okay, here's the reason why you might want to fly in for this. As in, speakers to me are always an excuse to get people to come to something. It's not the main event. And I'll never forget, we had young people coming from India and we couldn't pay for their flights. We just made the event free. But we had people who were selling their iPads and guitars and things like that to come to this event. And I was terrified. I was like, oh my God, what if you come to this and it sucks? Like,
that's a lot of pressure on you.
Never had this event before. Oh my God. And we held it at this high school, Mission High School in San Francisco. And yeah, I'll still remember the front doors of the high school. That, like, there's, one thing that is kind of cool sometimes about institutional buildings is they have cool architecture and has these huge doors. And we opened these doors and we were so afraid like no one was coming to our event. We're like, did we throw this whole thing? And did this poor guy sell his iPad? and like we got like one person and we opened the doors and there were 100 young people standing outside before we had officially opened the event. They're all chatting and talking to each other. And it was like, oh my God, this is why we do this. And this is that community builder part. And so we've always drawn that into 1517 as well of like, hey, like, I have a personal belief that one of the scarcest resources is human mind share. And if I can get two minds together and then they like, to me, it's always like an old Western. They're on horses. They go off into the sunset and like, who knows what's going to happen next? It's like, but it's like, these two people on horses, they go off into the sunset. That is like, to me, that there's something like very satisfying about that moment of like, wow, if we can get the right minds together, they're going to go off and do something. And I'm not going to know on the Sunday of the event, oh, what happened? Or like after this dinner we have here in St. Louis, who knows what's going to happen? But we'll hear from people years later. Oh yeah, I met at this summit. I met at that dinner and we had that great conversation. And it's like, that to me is super, super satisfying. And we just see like lots of positive outcome. So this has been a long story. But, I do think that piece of it has a real tangible effect on 1517 and what we do and who we work with. And it is the reason why other funds now are like, oh, we got to build a community. And I'm like, we've been doing that for 10 years with 1517, 15 years with the Thiel Fellowship. So yes, go do it. But you got to be in it for the long haul. I think a lot of people are in community because they think it's going to be cool to be a community builder. They're going to get some sort of gravitas from it. And then they like flame out really quickly. So you got to plant yourself and do it.
Yeah. The community build, as dramatic irony would have it, some people are building communities for ascension. And they usually seem to taper out. But we're big proponents of community building and even helping others build community. I think it's one of the most important things that we do. And to play it back into a little bit of a full circle moment, when I used to come to some of those early Thiel events, my very first one, there was this catharsis where it's like, oh my God, there's other people like me out there. I thought I was so alone. And I cannot put that feeling into words that I have found my place where it's like, it's okay to be me. And I think that's a big part of our job is creating space for people to be truly who they really are. And I think that's the most important part of our job.
Whenever you're having to, with the Thiel Fellowship, narrow from 400 and then eventually 1,000 applicants down to just 20 a year. Small question one is, what's the second most broad group that you have before you get to that final 20? Is it 40? Is it 100? A, and then B, what are the types of things or the heuristics that help separate the final 20 from the ones that don't make the cut that year?
So yeah, the numbers now are quite different in terms of how many people they're interviewing and the applicants. So I can only speak to the first 5 years there. But the typical,
There's got to be tens of thousands now, right? Or
yeah, it's really big.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really big. I was talking to the new director there and I was like, honestly, and he was asking for some advice and things like that. And I was like, listen, what I'm going to tell you is based on my time there, where the numbers were really manageable. And I think there are some ways to like kind of get back to some of the ethos from the earlier days. But yeah, the lift is way bigger. So I do not envy that position. Going through tens of thousands of applications is a whole other ballpark. But while we were there, yeah, we, just to start like I think it was something like, the first year was 400 applicants. I remember reading 120 applications and I felt like my eyeballs were bleeding out of my face. Like, cause we all read them ourselves. I think this is another piece of it that like people don't also get is people tend to set up these like subcommittees and these people will interview, but these people are going to be the ones working with the people. We just did everything. So we read applications and we had assistants on the reading, and we had mentors reading too, but we were like aggregating lots of people's feedback about things. We were doing all the interviewing. I think we tended to narrow it down to like, there was somewhere around like, I don't know what it was, maybe like a 50% cut who would make it to the next stage where we'd ask them, we had these set of questions that was, what do you want to do in the next 2 weeks, 2 months, and 2 years? And generally by the time we were getting to the second round of the review, like a couple months had passed. And so we'd go and we'd ask them like, hey, tell us about what's happened in the next 2 months. And it wasn't a gotcha. It wasn't like, oh, did they do it or not do it? It was more of looking at the reflective quality of somebody, because sometimes they might say, yeah, what I learned was that what I thought I was going to do was not the right focus. So now here's what I'm doing over here. And that was a totally great answer to give. I think when we were interviewing people, I think we tended to interview like the top 80 to 100. And then we narrowed it down to like, I don't like these words like top and things like that, but like then we narrowed it down to 40. And then we had to narrow it down to 20. And it was interesting because I was actually telling Harry on the car on the way here, we did this like Zoom Thiel Fellow reunion a few years ago during the pandemic. And I think what fellows really probably would have been very surprised by was that there was a lot of like data collection, and we had like these binders for each fellow with like reviews from mentors and all kinds of stuff. And with all that, at the end of the day, going back to the taste conversation, a lot of it was very intuitive. Our team would sit there, there were 5 of us, and we had a X and Y axis on the board for the first group of fellows. And on the like, on one of the axes was sort of like impact of project. And then the second one, it was more about the person of like, like, do we think they can sort of get started here kind of thing? And we'd write people's names on Post-it notes. And this is just on a whiteboard. And we would go up and we'd be trying to like gutturally be like, I think this person's like here on this axis. And we also did something called thumbs, which we still do at 15, 17, which is we'll be talking about someone. And at the foundation, we did this. And as a teacher, I love getting at knowledge that isn't influenced by other people. So when I taught, I would have students often shut their eyes and then raise their hands to answer certain questions of like, who thinks they understand this thing? Okay, everyone shut their eyes and now raise your hand so I can tell who thinks they're at a certain level. So we would do this with thumbs also, where we'd say, hey, what do we think of Dylan Field? Okay, we're going to do thumbs. Everyone shut your eyes and we're going to either be thumb up, middle, down, or some gradation. And, and we'd count down to 3, 3, 2, 1. And I was like, okay. Oh, interesting. One of, Dylan, it was pretty, like, he was a crowd favorite. So that one was probably all thumbs up. But we had lots of people we would fight about in terms of like who we should be picking. And it's funny, I'm realizing the train has left the station. I'm like, I forget the original question.
Oh, just how you were separating those final people. But yeah.
Yes. Okay. And yes, I'm getting to a point that I want to make, which is that, it was really hard because we'd be evaluating those 40 people who came out for the finalist round. An experiment I always wanted to do and never got to do, because I'm really interested in how resources affect people, was the experiment I wanted to do was do the old style like lottery ball where a number pops out and you're like, all right, this one's getting it. Like I always wanted to do something where it was like, okay, let's like pick our top 20 out of the 40 sort of at random. Like, let's just see what happens if people are given these resources rather than that we thought we like picked correctly or something like that. So I was always really curious. But yeah, to get to that group of Thiel Fellows, it was a lot of interviews and information. A lot of it had to do with some of these intuitions at the bottom of the review form for mentors who would come to an event and get to meet the finalists. One of the questions was, did you have more or less energy after talking to this person? And that has been a huge indicator over time. And we still use that at 15, 17 as one of our litmus tests. So we're always thinking about how do we get at like this like guttural, intuitive information about something. So that factored in a lot during the Thiel Fellowship days.
In what way has going from the Thiel Fellowship to now 1517 alleviated a constraint that you had with the Thiel Fellowship that like you have a new domain of freedom in doing this in 1517?
Oh, it's huge. One of the things that sometimes I've noticed, and this is just like a simple way I think about it, is that like I think we all have these mental hamster wheels that are running through our brains all the time about certain things, and we just don't even know they're there. And I think one of the hamster wheels that constantly ran when we were running the Thiel Fellowship was, is Peter going to be happy with this? Or what are other people going to say? Because this is such a public program, and people are going to sling whatever they want at Peter. What was really shocking, honestly, was people were slinging mud at like individual Thiel Fellows too in the early days, and we never anticipated that. And so when we started doing 1517, there was a real refreshingness of, oh my gosh, like that hamster wheel like fell off the back of the truck. This is great. We can do what we want. We don't have to be thinking about like the effect it's going to have on Peter. And we loved working for Peter and with Peter. And it's like a lot of lift to think about how what you're doing is going to affect a very sort of public person, and how anything you do, whether it is like the positive or the consequence, is going to land on that person, whether you like it or not. So that was really huge to be like, oh, like we're at the reins of this. Like we're now going to die by our sword, and there's no one else who's going to take the hit for what we're doing. We have to do that. So that was a really big change when we started 1517.
A question for you, Harry. Whenever I'd got my confirmation that you guys were going to back me over the summer, and I was, having some additional conversations to get additional capital, you encouraged me to make sure that in weaning down any other offers that would come in to partner with people that were our people, so as to not cause problems in the future in terms of just like the way that I wanted to run my company or the way that just to avoid future conflict. Talk a little bit about what you mean between what type of people you guys are and the type of people to for a founder like me potentially avoid on the cap table to avoid future problems, even if the money might come easy.
Wow, what type of people are we? That's a loaded question.
Well, in the sense that you meant it a couple months ago, right?
Well, okay. Look, people like you, I'll start with that. People like you are on the path to the frontier of knowledge. And in your case, that is a specific branch of longevity and how stem cells are created. And pursuing that path is very difficult. There's on this path, there's snakes, there's ditches you can fall into, there's mountains you have to climb, there's rides you might have to hitch. And the people who you end up bringing on this journey, on this, like, let's call it wildy coyote journey, as we like to call it in 1517, you'll come across people that are good co-passengers, that can be helpful, that can be harmful. And I think the biggest trait of somebody who's helpful to somebody like you is the type of person that creates the space and then also is tactically helpful. But at the early stage, because you're solving so many 0 to 1 problems, or so many wicked problems, if to do the early callback, you need somebody who just understands and creates the space and the conditions for you to best operate. Now, I don't know what traits it takes for that to happen, because a lot of the work that, and I'm learning from, Michael and Danielle, a lot of it is this idea of trying to wrap my mind around the type of person, the founder that's sitting in front of us, and what do they need, and reaching the olive stick exactly where it will be valuable for them. Sometimes we get it right. A lot of times we get it right. Sometimes we get it wrong, and we're continue to do better. So I think a big part of it is, and I'm talking in abstract terms here, but a lot of it is just creating that space for the weirdo cool thing to happen, whether that be a science discovery, whether that be landing a massive customer, whether that be finding a co-founder, whether that be figuring out some new business model of way of figuring something out. That could be a growth strategy. That could be like a supplier deal, whatever it is that helps you solve that wicked problem. So yeah, that's how I think about it.
That checks out. Is there anything that you'd add?
Yeah, one piece I would add is that going back to some of that onboarding conversation that we have with teams is that you're the captain of the ship. And we want other people to be on board that ship who get that is your position, and not only don't take it from you, but don't want to take it from you. Like where they, you have to have this sort of bright-eyed belief in the people that you're working with, and to Harry's point, to give them that spaciousness to grow into who they will become. And that takes a lot of patience. And we've seen lots of investors who say they have patience, but then when things are not, they have lots of patience when things are going well, but they don't have patience when things aren't going well. And we've seen people try to grab the wheel of that ship. And it's interesting, also going back to what you talked about in that onboarding of, hey, we write it down to 0. That's important because we want that to give the freedom for people we work with to swing for the fences. And what I found is interesting over time is seeing investors who, when things are not going well, they try to jump onto a board, grab the helm, things like that. And what, in my opinion, what they're doing is they're trying to, it's like, there might have, in their opinion, there might be a car accident happening, but they're picking up shards of glass off the ground. But that's not our job. We're not here to pick up pennies after an accident. We're here to really create extraordinary opportunities, and in financial terms, then therefore returns. And so for us, it's really just about honoring that person's journey. And if the right thing for them is to move on to something, then we honor that. And if the right thing is to back that founder and be no, we believe and we trust you, and you need to do what you need to do no matter what these other investors are saying, we want to do that. But ideally, sort of the cap table of entities that is there are all there to support you in coming into the fullness of your leadership. And it is incredibly hard to find those people, because it's one thing to say it, but it's another to see it through over time. So the thing I tell founders is, talk to other founders in that portfolio to get a sense for, hey, what happens when things aren't good? Who do you want to make a phone call to when you're having a hard time on your cap table? Things like that are really important.
You guys do something that's really unique as a fund, and that's that you do closing ceremonies for founders, right? Whenever they are winding down a company or realizing that journey is over. what does it look like to both know that it's time to make that decision? What does that ceremony look like? And then I can think of someone who's going through that situation right now, and they're asking themselves questions like, we're realizing that we're winding down and we don't have a pivot and we still have $250,000 in the bank, and we have decisions to make, like, do we give that money back to investors? Do we keep paying ourselves for a couple months and try to figure something out? Talk a little bit about, like that side. Like, nobody likes to think about failure, but it's a part of the job, and you guys kind of participate in that process uniquely.
Sure. Yeah. So officially, we don't have anything, like, we have our onboarding. We haven't officially started what I would deem sort of worthy of a closing ceremony. But one of our founders, actually, this is his third swing at bat as a founder, and he's had some great outcomes before as well. But he actually gave this idea of doing something like a closing ceremony, or he calls it a funeral, where he told us about, when our company was acquired by another company, it was a really solid exit, but there was still a mourning process that we had to go through. And he actually talked about that. Yeah, they hosted essentially a funeral for, like, what they had wanted the future of their company to look like was now going to be very, very different. And I really loved that. And right now what we do at 1517 is we continue to have these conversations with founders. And so when things are moving into that wrap-up period, within sort of the purview of our reviews, we'll talk about, like, hey, let's talk about how this is. And then, with our teams, and especially for me, if I'm working with a team, even when they've wrapped it up and they think they're done wrapping up, I'm like, hey, you know what? Let's keep the next review 2 months out from now still on the calendar, because, like, you're going to be processing things in a really different way once you've actually closed a chapter rather than when you're in the process of closing the chapter. So I really enjoy having that touch point. And then, of course, we are just always keeping in touch with people over time. But actually having something like a closing ceremony is something I've wanted to build into 1517, of, like, hey, like, let's put a wrapper on this, and, like, let's have something where this feels complete. Because I really like that we do the onboarding, and I'd like to have something that has a little more gravitas to it, like a closing, or, I mean, maybe people want to call it a funeral or whatever they want to call it. But it's an important piece of the process. And right now we individually do that with teams. But I think it would be really beautiful to do it in a more ceremonial way.
And for me, I think you guys were really supportive when I was winding down Medela. And especially one thing you said that I want to underline, that call, that one extra call. When things have tapered out, at least I was in a very different mindset, and I'd figured out what I wanted to do next and where I was going to go. And you guys were, it's like, there was this, it's a very similar energy, like, okay, you still go be you. And Mike and Danielle were able to show that to me, not just when I was a founder, but even when I was winding down my business. So there was this consistency that I really, really respected.
One of my favorite questions to ask both my peers to make me a better person, or, like, my employees on occasion, RJ and I bounce this question back and forth regularly. I've probably asked it to you, is in what way do you perceive me to be most naive? And I think that's because it's a very telling question. For someone to think of a good answer to that for you, they have to know what's in your unknown, your wicked window. And so I say that to say, what is a way that, generally speaking, you guys, as the entity that works with founders, perceive founders to most consistently be naive? Or what are some of the types of things that founders are naive to on a regular basis?
First off, I just think that's a beautiful question. I'm like, that is really good. Borrowing, putting in our hopper for thinking more about. I also love the frame of, like, naivete. I actually think naivete is something that really, like, largely helps people to move forward, because when you don't know how big the beast is that you're about to go slay, you're like, yeah, of course I'm good. I'm heading right for it. No problem. And then you're like, whoa, okay. Now I know what it's really like, the visceral experience of it. But yeah, first, I just think that Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I think there's, lots of places people are naive. But Harry, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah.
You can answer for me if you'd like.
Well, I think I told you this when I was in your home the first time I was coming to St. Louis.
Nothing sacred in his home, Harry. You're just like, boom. Like,
you're like, you have no idea how hard this is going to be. You've got no clue. No, I'm kidding.
I mean, I kind of did say that. I kind of did say exactly that, probably in a nicer way.
Yeah, you said specific things like your ventilation in here is not right, and the air control in this room is not going to be sufficient for cell culture, and these types of things.
This is why we love having Harry on board at 15, 17. Is like Mike and I would never know to say that. So it's like, wow, this tactical stuff. It's amazing.
We had this other guy. I think you were there when we met this brilliant young man. He is etching microelectronics in his apartment, which is, for those listeners that don't know, that's very, very toxic. And he's just doing this in his apartment. And we were like, hey, man, are you sure you want to be doing this in your apartment? His answer, I kid you not, was, yeah, I keep the window open. But that's like a brilliant naivete. To Danielle's point, we want a little bit of don't put yourself in harm's way, but this certainly was the case for me. If I had known all the things about company building that were going to be so hard, a rational version of Harry would not have started the company in the first place. It's really hard to play the what if game, but I'm glad I had rationality, the irrationality, because that just made it easier. So yeah, I'm also in Danielle's camp of I look at naivete as this very positive thing. And I think naivete is the antidote to being jaded, basically. And in general, I think far too many people are jaded already. And especially a trend I'm noticing in the younger generation. And I don't know where some of this stuff comes from. Maybe it's social media or I don't know, but there's this if they're able to conquer this fear of what if I fail? What if this doesn't work out? I think they're a force to be reckoned with. And a lot of the conversations that I have with some of these brilliant young people is it's okay. I failed a gazillion times. It's normal. It's par for the course. If you're not getting something wrong, then you're not trying a hard enough problem. Go try something crazier.
One of my other investors who I think both of you guys know, Justin Mayers, talks about the ability of founders to fail upward. Or at least that he was referencing this in a conversation one time. And the thing that I'm trying to frame a question around is the idea that I've recognized this in so I had a business that was Uber for housekeepers, totally unrelated to what I'm doing right now, right? And I actually dropped out of my biomedical engineering degree in order to pursue that business because it was starting to actually make money while school was only going to cost money for the next 8 years. And I didn't know, that the decision seemed easy at the time. And I more or less failed that business. COVID happened and, we were built on short-term rentals. And so all of that revenue went out the door as travel went out the door. But I was able to put it on MicroAcquire and, plug in the Stripe. And I'd never raised venture either. I only raised friends and family. So it was able to get off okay there and position it in such a way that it was a success. But the reason I say all of that is how do you balance the line, or how do you help founders think about, or how would you guys think about balancing the line whenever you have something that is a failure in the grand scheme, but whenever you're thinking about the concept of using that as an opportunity to fail upward, telling the story so that you get your, in my case, I got my fancy business journal article where my picture in a suit is there and I sold my company to this group in Connecticut or whatever. But in reality, that was a failure.
Well, if you're doing hard and meaningful work, I don't think there's bad failure because you've explored. There's so many companies, for example, that end up going public and have incredible financial returns, but then they might not launch their product on on especially those that happen in therapeutics.
Mm.
Does that mean that that founder didn't fail upwards? I think they learned an incredible amount by going through clinical trials, building a company, hiring a team, or working with CROs. And I think that that equivalent is true in so many industries. So it's hard to know. And I think the tougher question is, what does meaningful work look like? And I have a terribly cop-out answer for this, which is it just depends. Because a good founder will go after this really hard problem that has not been solved before. And as a result, meaningful work to solve that particular problem has never been done. So it's hard to know what that feels like. The pattern matching data doesn't exist.
There's something coming to mind for me about what you said earlier, Harry, about jadedness. I feel like failing downwards looks like if the only thing you can look at is, oh, financially this didn't do what I wanted it to do, so therefore it's a failure, which means I'm a failure and all this stuff, and then you're jaded about what you're doing. Like, that is a tragedy. I think a lot of the people that we work with are able to see that, yeah, like there were lots of different gates and moments in that journey, that are things that like you can learn and reflect on and be able to use for the next thing you're doing. I'll never forget, actually. I'd be curious. I know, Harry, you know who this person is. It's another Velocity founder out of Waterloo. But I remember talking to this guy. This was
James. Are you talking about James and Bobby?
No, it's not James and Bobby. This person we met when we were in the Thiel Fellowship days, and he was working on some sort of chemistry thing. It was like more on the hard tech side, especially when we're thinking like 13-ish years ago. But what he said to me was, Danielle, this is killing me because I know I am killing my first baby. He's like, there's all these people around here who have done apps and other things, and they've gotten to learn the hard parts of building a team and raising some money and, getting health insurance for a team on things they don't really care about. But I'm doing it on this thing that I really care about that's really hard to do, and it's killing me. And it's interesting because I've always wanted to find this guy and be like, hey, like, it's been 13 years. What's your reflection now on that? Because I think it's important that like what you're working on is important and that you really do care about it. And it's not doing the founder thing to be a founder, which is, I think, what he was kind of talking about with these other people. But at the same time, I think there was a lot of value in what he was saying was, gosh, these people did essentially these projects that weren't really startups. They thought they were startups, but they weren't. But they got all these learnings from it. And now they can embed those learnings in the next thing that they want to do that they really care about that might be much higher stakes. And I think a lot of the founders we work with are able to think in sort of a similar way of like, this is something I super care about, but there's lots of things that I care about. And I'm going to take these learnings and I'm going to put them into what I do next, sort of no matter what. While admitting, sometimes there are things that are within our control that, okay, yeah, woulda, coulda, shoulda on these, arenas. But then there's plenty of things that people can't control given markets and different opportunities and things like that. And you have to be able to separate the two out, like what you're responsible for and what you can let go of. But yeah, I think the most dreaded failure to me would be someone who's just like, oh, well, I didn't, all was for naught because I didn't get to the money part.
Yeah. This, one of our colleague, Alex, talks about this, is this idea of founder identity. So if you make your identity just your company, it's like, I am my company is me, then that leaves very little room for when the company's doing bad, you automatically end up feeling bad, which to some extent is okay. But I think the trait, if you're in this state and you're listening to this, what I would say is separate out, you have to create this sort of like understanding of what your circle of influence is. And here are the things that I can do. And this is what we call the internal loci of control versus the external loci of control. There's all these things that are happening externally. And the best thing you can do in any of these circumstances is make an informed decision with the data that you have and whatever thought process, logic, intuition, whatever mindset you have. Those are the only two things you have. And if you did your best to use those two things, then you're fine. You shouldn't play the what if game of like, oh, only if I thought about this longer, or only if I made this decision slightly differently. Regret is the enemy, regret is the friend of jadedness.
What if you only had two buckets to put your founders in? Percentage are very passionate, but pursuing a idea, and in the other bucket are very passionate but pursuing their life's work.
Oh, that's an interesting question. And when you say pursuing an idea, I mean, you mean something like they're sort of interested in. You don't mean just like, oh, they started early with it. Because some people in startup land use the word idea to mean like this is super early. I think what you're trying to pull apart is like people who are working on their calling versus people who are like doing one of potentially many things they might do.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. Something that they would be something that if someone came along 2 or 3 years in and offered them to acquire it earlier than they thought they'd have to run for that, they'd be stoked and they'd consider it a win versus like if someone, maybe you guys don't want to hear this. If someone came to me in 2 or 3 years and wanted to acquire Ion, I would be like, the fuck you will.
Great.
We love that actually.
Go big or go home.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the calling piece is really important. And we talk about this a lot with founders. We talk about this a lot as we're talking to people about 15, 17 in general. Is like we're looking for people who are, we use this phrase, it's such a common vernacular, but willing to die on one's sword. And to me, that means like this is something that is a calling for you. This isn't just like, oh, I want to be a founder. I don't know exactly percentage-wise what I would put in, but like there is definitely a large percentage of people where what they're doing it's their calling. This is what they're supposed to be doing. And we often talk about this in the onboarding too, of like, we want to get you onto the thing that's your calling, whether that's the thing you've been funded here to do, or maybe that's joining somebody else because you think what they're doing is the thing you're supposed to be doing, or maybe it's something else completely. But that's a really, really important piece. I guess like on the like, I think very few of our founders have the like, oh, if I got a great offer in a few years, I would just take it and go. Like, that said, I wouldn't necessarily, even though those people would be on for the long haul, I wouldn't say that like every single founder is in the calling bucket. But they're in the like this is super important to me. But I think a calling has a different flavor to it. Like
it wouldn't surprise me to know that the 95% of you guys as founders are in the calling bucket. Just because it's, I don't know. I feel like as a founder, whenever I was doing my runaround, I think the thing that I tried to do for every conversation I had was understand what the thesis is of the firm that I'm talking to. And some firms' theses are as simple as, I want to make money off of you over a 5 to 7 year time period.
Wow, that's short. Must be Series A.
Or longer, or whatever. Or like say you guys, like you have a thesis to back, dropouts and renegade scientists working at the earliest stages of their companies. Or like one of my other like backers, Long Journey Ventures, like they say that while the typical return cycle of a fund is, X to Y years, we do like to back people that are going long and that are working on magically weird things and that are doing their life's work. And so I say that to say, I think that understanding what that angle is when interfacing with a fund helps you know as a founder, like who you do want to have be your partner. And that's why I guess going back to the point that we were talking about before in terms of like whether they're in the idea bucket or in the calling bucket, like you guys have a thesis that sort of, I don't know, dropouts in renegade science isn't implicitly in the calling bucket, but if you have dropped out for something, or if you're
Yeah.
doing renegade science, there's a sort of pre-selection that you've dropped out for
Yep.
a reason, or you're doing renegade science for a reason that is more directly in alignment than I had an idea to drop out and
Yeah.
do this
If you're
thing.
bucking a whole system sort of interpersonally to do something,
Mhm.
it's because it's important to you. Like hands down. And it's interesting too, because people often ask us if it's sort of easy to suss out the calling people from the more like, I think there could be a business here people. And at least for us, it seems extraordinarily easy to suss that out because you ask about these origin stories of like, hey, how did you start thinking about this? And when did this start? And tell us about when you were 8 and like things like that. And it just like kind of comes out. And, we had a pitch recently with a team who was more on the like, I think there's a business here side. And we tried to softball to them a couple times, like, hey, like, yeah, why are you working on this? And they're like, yeah, no, we just think the market's really huge. It's like gigantic. I'm like, all right. And then another colleague on the call, like, also softballed again, like, I don't remember how he phrased it. He phrased it really great, but it was like sort of another, like, tell us why you're willing to die on your sword for this. And the answer again was like, because there's a huge market. It was like, okay, because there's a huge market is not going to like get you through the dark night of the soul of when this is not working, when you're facing metric tons of rejection because people aren't funding you or people are saying no to working with you or whatever it is. It's like, it's going to be because it's something that's like deeply important to you that you're going to go through those dark nights of the soul, not because you can somehow magically see fame and fortune on the other side. And I think some of our founders, who have even gotten to the fame and fortune part, it's not a panacea for like, oh yeah, everything's just easy now. Life's an interesting place.
What are some things about, as a founder, interfacing with venture capital funds in general that most founders don't know that if they knew would help them be more successful in talking to funds, whether it's a pitch or just being in conversation? Like for me, the space we're in, the guy that I worked with for a little while, Vance, gave me this heuristic at one point. He was like, if you have 30 minutes to make an introduction with somebody, what 9 out of 10 or maybe 90 out of 100 people are probably going to do is try to get in as much context and facts and rational reasons for them to decide on you as possible within that 30-minute introduction, so you can get your hour-long diligence call or whatever. And he's like, what I would challenge you to do instead is spend the first 15 minutes of a 30-minute call asking questions, and then wait for them to start asking you questions for the latter 15 minutes, and just take the opportunity to position yourself as a person of integrity. Because if they believe you to be a person of integrity who tells good stories and these sorts of things, then, inherently they'll want to go deep on the facts with you. And those things can come later, but nobody's going to make a decision. Nobody's going to make a decision to invest in you in the first 30-minute intro based on the facts. And maybe that's wrong, but I think that was what he was trying to get in at the point.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I struggled incredibly with that. So, when you're an engineer or a technical person, when somebody asks you a question, your immediate reaction is like, oh, they're asking me a question. I should tell them the fact. I should tell them what I know about this. And that is not how, storytellers or good salespeople or good founders usually think. And it took me a while to realize this. Instead, they'll have a bunch of questions going through their mind, which is like, why is he asking me this question now? What data does he have that he thought to ask this? Or, what change that's leading to this question? Where is he going with this question? And that allows me either asking that question back, or if I already have a good understanding, that allows me to give a better version of that answer. And yeah, this is sort of the dichotomy of the, traditional engineer. Is like, we just want to get information out as quickly as possible because everything is about information exchange and it's this rational thing. But yeah, you've hit on something that's so important where, the scientist, engineer, founder needs to grow into this like human part that was really, really, really tough for me, and I had to learn it. Like, it took me months and years to figure this out.
Mhm.
I don't know if that does not answer your question, but I just wanted to riff on what you were saying.
Oh, for sure. In fact, like RJ took this class. This guy Vance does courses sometimes whenever people build up, and those courses were the product of what started as sort of like communication rules for Aspie's handbook. And it's like all of these little sort of models that logically brained people can use to have better conversations and to interface with people more effectively.
Yeah.
I say often, I'd say it again, working with Vance Crowe for 4 years changed my life for a number of reasons, but definitely gave me the ability to communicate with people and understand. And I think the core thing was, are you guys familiar with interest-based negotiations?
No.
Really? Oh gosh, I'll do the interest-based negotiations thing then. Okay, so traditional negotiation is what, right? Where both parties walk away slightly disappointed. That's the conventional that's the conventional wisdom of a good negotiation. And so according to conventional negotiation, let's say that there's an orange right here, and Harry, you want the orange, and Danielle, you also want the orange. What is conventional negotiation?
Orange.
What are you guys going to do with that orange if you negotiate per conventional wisdom and come to a compromise?
You split it in half.
Perfect answer, Danielle.
You are both somewhat dissatisfied about that.
Exactly.
Well, I would be like, Danielle, do you want the zest, or do you or do you want the meaty part of the orange? Because maybe I want the zest that I want to make into this.
That's right.
Nice job.
Exactly.
Because that's interest-based negotiations. You want to say,
I see.
It's like, okay, because you were interested in making Negronis. I like to give this riff when I'm drinking a Negroni or something like this, right? What you didn't realize, person I'm giving this analogy to, is that I wanted to make Negronis with the peel and that you were hungry. And then, well, the thing that you could say to that is, but what if we were both hungry, or what if we both wanted the peel? It's like, okay, well, we have an asset here. It's an orange. You can both use the peel for all sorts of things, essential oils and whatnot, and you can feed people. And so let's take this asset, see if we can expand the boundaries within which we're negotiating, and go trade it out in the field in order to get enough of what we both want. And that's the TLDR on interest-based negotiations.
Yeah, you taught me this is brilliant. Yeah, I never thought of it. There was a word for this.
Vance's, I'll send you his podcast after.
Yeah, I would love to listen.
Check it out.
This is reminding me when we were first fundraising for 1517. I loved thinking about people's needs, like human needs on like a nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg theory type of level, if you've come across his work. But one of the potential investors that we were pitching, basically he was very blunt with us, and he's a literal billionaire, and he's like, I don't need your money. Like, so I don't do fund investing. And we had flown actually to LA to meet with this guy. And the first thing he said was like, we're shaking his hand, and he's like, I don't invest in funds. We're like, cool. I'm glad we're here. And we got to know him in the course of this conversation. And what came out in that conversation was that he was particularly interested in longevity work, and also, just some different interesting, what would be considered maybe fringe fields at the time. And of course, we know people in those spaces. And we said to him, hey, we're happy to introduce you to people like Laura Deming and other people in these spaces. And he's like, oh, really? And I was like, well, yeah, of course we'd intro you to these people. And we made those intros for him. We followed up with him. We were like, hey, hope those calls have gone really well. And, they weren't like diligence calls for 1517. It was just like, hey, you want to talk about these topics with these people, like, go do it. And he came back and we were talking to him, and we were like, hey, we'd love to make more of these intros for you. And we will do it anytime. And we would do it just because you asked. And we are running a business called a VC fund. If you happen to want to like be closer to the types of people we work with, because you get to meet lots of these people, we'd love to have you on board. And actually, it was a really interesting moment for me, because I had come from the nonprofit space where you're just like happy if someone gives you $1 for something. And he asked us on the call, what did he say? He said something like, how much do you want? And we weren't ready for that question. He was probably one of the first people we were like pitching. And we said 500K. He says, okay, I'm in. And for the first 3 seconds, I was elated. I was like, oh my God, I got the whole orange. This is amazing. Seconds 4 and 5, I thought, oh my God, I should have asked for more. He didn't even flinch at 500K. I should have asked for $2 million, like, or, something like that. So it's this really big lesson in negotiations in terms of like, okay, his need is not for us to like make his bank statement better. He wants to meet really interesting people on the cutting edge, and we have access to that. And we were clear, we'll give this to you anyways. We would give it to you for free. And if you want to work with us, that would help us out a lot. And he came in. So yeah, really like, yeah, I'll never forget that feeling of elation and then immediate, oh no, I did it wrong right afterwards.
Oh, that resonates. I was telling Harry a story about this today, actually. In this room a couple weeks ago in November, someone came through, and a friend of theirs, they bought a legacy interview for their friend. So he was hanging out. And Vance texted me, he said, hey, there's a person here I think that you should come meet. You'd get value out of this interaction. I sat at that table over there with him for about 2 hours, just kind of chatting about things. And he knew all about Michael Levin and bioelectricity and was able to talk within the language of like AI and things. And the most interesting part of the conversation was talking about culture and, like building a company where every single person inside of it's a leader and these sorts of things. And at this person also was, very, very financially secure, to say the least.
Sure.
And so at one point in the conversation, I, found an opportunity to say, okay, well, would you write me a investment for 50 grand? He was like, oh yeah, don't even need to think about it. Like that's.
You're like, oh no.
Yeah, well, kind of. And I should bite my tongue because that conversation's ongoing. So maybe I'll follow up with you guys about that.
Yeah.
But
amazing.
yeah, so yeah, like I can relate to asking for too little sometimes, I guess.
Oh yeah.
It's a common trait. It happens to everybody. The first business deal, the first negotiation, or the first few even, not just the first one. Where it's like, yeah, I could have asked for more, but I didn't. So I always tell founders, ask for the most ridiculous number that you think they'll say yes to.
What are give like one model or one heuristic for defining, like I can think of insane numbers, but adding on the caveat of what they will say yes to is harder to model.
Well, yeah, this is where the sales brain needs to come in, where it's like you have to ask them a bunch of questions. Like there's this wrapping your head around what their function is, what their interest is, and then mapping to that. So it's like, how much is you're effectively trying to figure out the answer to the question, how much is this problem worth to them? Or sorry, how much is the solution to this problem worth to them? And usually companies, especially if you're selling to large businesses, will have some budget allocated. They have an internal version of that answer. And usually whoever your champion is within this company will tell you this number. But there's a method to get to that, to build a relationship with the champion such that they share this information.
What makes your guys' limited partners different from other funds' limited partners? Or I guess if you had to put parameters around you guys' limited partners, how would you define that archetype that wants to partner with you guys?
We use the word wily a lot at 1517, especially in the last year. It's become like this archetypal word for the types of people we work with. And I think a lot of the LPs we work with are also wily types of people and come from wily families. We work a lot with family offices and individuals. And so they have these stories about, oh yeah, my mom and dad started this business out of their garage and it became X, Y, and Z. Or, we have the inventors of the Duraflame log as part of our fund. It's just like these kind of wild stories. So I think a lot of them also have that like high agency sort of background and high agency families. A lot of them are also interested in how can their family's legacy business come into the future, and, how do they think about the future of whatever that space will become. And some of that is through their own development that they're doing at their, some of the companies that they run, in some of the investments that they make. But I think particularly in 15, 17 and the types of people that they're meeting that we're introducing them to. And yeah, that wiliness I think is a big, component. We're out there raising fund 4 right now. And so we actually just closed our first multifamily office yesterday, which is really exciting because often bigger checks, which is really nice to be supported in that way. And starting to also work with some more institutional investors. And so we're going to learn a lot about what is it like to work with these different types of LPs, because I think, the family offices and the individuals of the world, I think are going to have that really wily characteristic. Many of them come from families where college wasn't put, up on a pedestal. And so they really get that ethos. And I'll be really curious as we work with multifamily offices and institutions of like, will we, my guess is that the wiliness is a bit more diluted in those organizations. But actually, in the case of this multifamily office that just came in, it sounds like the families that they serve do have some of that wily character to them. And so I love that that's still part of it, because we really like to think a lot about those who we're serving in terms of like, okay, we can't do what we do without the support of our LPs. And so at the end of the day, like our job is to make them extraordinary returns and make them really proud and make history doing it by backing incredible people working on incredible technologies and science.
You guys did not originally have an easy time interfacing with institutions or raising capital and some of these sorts of or maybe not raising,
it's changed over time. I mean, the learning that I'm having right now as we're out there in this current now 2025 market, raising our 4th fund, is that the market that you are in matters a lot. And it's interesting. We've been talking a lot about, when you're in the founder seat and you don't have control over what's going on, but you're facing different headwinds and how you navigate that. And I've been looking at this a lot right now because our fund 1 actually came together incredibly fast. It came together in 8 months, start to finish. Like we sat down with Peter. We weren't even pitching him for money. We were pitching him to please don't be mad at us for leaving our jobs. And then he committed in that meeting. And I was like, what just happened? Oh my God. And then from that's got to be a good lead. Breakfast. It was amazing. I smiled so big that I covered my mouth. I thought I had robbed a bank. I was like, we just walked out of this meeting with more money than Peter had ever given us in any 1 year of the fellowship. And I was like, what? Like, we should have left years ago. Like, this is crazy.
I'm curious, did you ask him for enough? Do you think you could have swung more?
I mean, well, here's the thing is that we didn't actually ask. So in that meeting, in that meeting, we're sitting there telling him about how, we want his blessing to leave the foundation to start this venture fund because we think this vehicle, this tool is the way to scale our work. And, I expected him to be mad in this meeting and just kind of like a how dare you want to leave or something like that, which is weird because he's not like that. I don't know. This is some like archetypal, oh, your boss has to think this way about it thing that was coming down on me. But he asked, he's like, and this is a funny dynamic between me and Mike is that, yes, I do most of the negotiating at 15, 17. Somehow Mike avoids it. But in this meeting with Peter, he turned and he says, well, how much you guys raising? And like both him and Mike kind of look at me and I'm like, oh, what the, like, oh my God. And I was like, oh, we're thinking about raising 10 million. And Peter looks at the ground and you can kind of see the wheels are turning and, he's just thinking and thinking and thinking. And he looks up and he says, you should raise 15 and I'll be 4 of it. And I was like, what? And that's when I smiled really big and was like, oh my God, what is happening in this meeting? Like, I thought we were just pitching, like, please don't mind that we're leaving. And I remember Mike and I high-fived out the door, from that meetive. And I don't remember exactly which one of us said it, but one of us said to the other, wow, now we got to go raise a venture fund. Like, oh my God. And we have the most primo angel investor in the world backing us with an anchor check. Like amazing. So that fund came together really quickly. We had this narrative about the fellowship and putting in these 100K grants, and what if they had been hypothetically an investment, what that would look like. And of course, Peter backing us. And this is in 2015. And so that fund came together incredibly fast. Fund 2 is a 2019 vintage, and the market was much cooler. Also, people had to make, in Fund 1, people had to make kind of a guttural decision. You're either in or you're out. There's not much data here. In Fund 2, people needed to feel like they made a real considered decision, not just a guttural like, all right, I'm going to believe in these people or not. And when you're an angel pre-seed fund in your third year, you don't have lots of markups on the books. We had Luminar tracking really well. We had Loom tracking well. I don't think either of them had, maybe Loom had a price round at that point, but Luminar had raised on safes, and Luminar eventually, the happy part is that Luminar eventually IPOs a whole year later. But it was very, very difficult to raise that second fund because it didn't make sense to people. It was like, we're a venture fund, but the math numbers aren't adding up yet to successful venture fund. So people had to square sort of like their gut in their head. So that was it took us a whole year just to get to a first close for that fund. When we think back, we think, wow, we really should have just waited for that time instead of like burning so much energy, like trying to fundraise. Fund 3 came together incredibly fast. We had the Luminar IPO. So our LPs were incredibly happy. And in fact, the majority of them filled out Fund 3, in a 4-month period. It was very fast. The market in general for startups at that point, this is 2022. IPOs were really hot. Things were going. So the money came very fast. And now we're in 2025 and we haven't had IPOs much in the whole venture world for a while now. And we're hoping in, about a year, things are like warming back up. But it's much harder. Even though our fund has performed very well. We have lots of different vehicles and special purpose vehicles we've done for companies that are tracking incredibly well right now. And like we're just swimming in an English channel that has like a way heavier current than when we were fundraising last time. So it's been this interesting reflective time of like, it was like really easy during Fund 3 to be like, oh, we're just good at what we do. Or during Fund 1 to be like, yeah, we're good at what we do. Like, and then you get in a harder market and you're like, okay, we're good at what we do, but holy moly, I got to lift some heavier weights. Like, I got to work out some more here. It's going to be a heavier lift. So it's been fascinating to see the different ecosystems that we've raised in.
What does it mean to do I know SPV means special purpose vehicle, but in practice, what does it mean to do that for a portfolio company? What does that look like?
Sure.
Why would you do that as opposed to just deploying inside of a normal fund?
Yeah. So at a point, you have to stop deploying out of a fund because a fund has a portfolio theory effect to it. And so in general, you don't want to do generally something like 10% from your fund into any one portfolio company. And that's written into your partnership documents and things like that. So that's a large piece of it. So you do want to maximize on that capital. You want to have your fund come in as heavily swinging as it can, but there is a limit to what that looks like. So then what we do with our founders is we often say like, hey, we're very early, but also very long-term capital. And if things are going really well, typically past a Series A, we call it ringing the dinner bell at 15, 17 of like, all right, things are going really well for you. You have a lead on like a Series B plus round, and you need some more quiet supportive capital on the cap table. And then we see this especially for like hard tech, deep tech companies. We're happy to get that rounded up for you generally within a 3-week period. So we have founders get on a Zoom with our LPs, have a conversation, share about what they're doing, answer questions. And we always tell our LPs like, hey, this is only open for, the next 2 weeks, basically, we need to know what you want. And then, we siphon money into one account, we throw it into your account, and that's kind of it. Like that's how we do it. It's interesting because I was talking to another fund manager recently, and he was talking about how he has a hard time filling out SPVs. All of our SPVs have filled out. In fact, the most common narrative is that we have to go back to the founder and say, hey, we actually have more demand than what you've allocated for us. Can we get a little bit more?
Mhm.
And I think founders are pretty savvy, and you're like, yep, already planned for that. Like, okay, good. But I was talking to another fund manager, and he's like, oh yeah, we put together SPVs when we think things are going well, but there's not like a lead yet, and there isn't this and that. And, for us, we know that on our LP, basis, I'm sure many would love to just like, make their own informed decisions. And some of them do, and some of them go direct into these companies, but some need to see, okay, somebody else is leading this, somebody else has set terms. We know what we're getting into. There's a little bit more, there's more information there, and then they can make a quicker decision because of that. So that's, we have 14 SPVs that we've done for companies over the last 10 years. And we started doing SPVs in about year 3 of 15-17.
Has it gotten easier for you guys in time, or was it always easy to interface with universities?
We've had different challenges. We got thrown at, like, we were banned from MIT at one point, not as 15-17, but as a Thiel Fellowship.
Heard this story.
Yeah. We supported MIT hacks. The university didn't like it. We also flyered the infinite corridor to no end. I don't think they liked that very much either. So at one point they asked us not to come back. And we were vaguely respectful of that and would just do coffee shop meetings across the street kind of thing. But we've never been banned from anything on the 15-17 side. What I find interesting is it's always administrators who want to get into it with you about something. The teachers actually really enjoy our message. A good teacher wants to have a classroom of students who want to be there and are engaged. And they want that. They don't want people there just to be there. And I think a lot of people who are teachers have seen over time, wow, so many students are here because they think they have to be here, not because they want to be here. Going back to sort of that passion thing again. So yeah, classrooms are always really happy to have us. So we speak to high school classrooms, university classrooms. We do office hours on campuses. And it's really only anyone in admin who, and even then, it's very few and far between who have a problem with anything. And some admin or some faculty are really great about, hey, I've got this wily person who I think you should talk to. But I don't know, Harry, if you've had other experiences on campus.
No, yeah, that happens all the time. More often than not. It's I already have somebody. Yeah. You got to meet them while you're here.
Right. Please help get them out of here.
Yeah. It happens all the time.
Yeah.
And Waterloo, the school I went to, and then dropped out, is notorious for this. So Waterloo dropouts are known for two things. You drop out of Waterloo to either start a company or you drop out to go play poker.
Oh, wait, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know about the poker bit.
So some of the best poker players that are Canadian will come out of this group.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah. So they probably will never publish their dropout stats, but if we ever could, the Waterloo dropout stats are going to be crazy high on money earned either playing poker or money earned building companies.
Wow, that's wild.
How strongly do you guys believe in sort of the coastal elitism as far as not as it pertains to paper belt behaviors, you guys would say, but more so in terms of if you're going to build a startup, you've got to be in the Bay, or you've got to be in Boston, or you've got to be in a hub. So how do you guys think about that, partnering with early stage companies?
It's interesting. I think we're of sort of multiple minds about it, at different times. So we're very positive on that there is talent everywhere, and that there are people building great things all over. And so that's why we come to different ecosystems that are maybe less commonly visited by the venture community. So that's really important to us. And one of the things that we've seen over time is that doing things like like, I think you need to be where your customers are to get started, like getting those really quick feedback cycles, being able to have unstructured time with a customer and like going to lunch, stuff like that, really, really important. And another learning has been over time that being in a place where the talent pool that you need to hire from is really important. I'll never forget when Michael and I were meeting, we had a lovely breakfast with Mark Andreessen. I think this was 2019. And he, at the time, was very, very bullish on like, it's got to be a big city. And we were like, I don't know. Talent's, our thing is like, hey, like there's good talent anywhere. And he's like, yeah, but they're going to need to be somewhere where they can hire. And we were like, I don't know. And now, looking at this almost 6 years later, it's like, okay, like our companies that have jumped from like early startup team to building, like, I don't know how to put it, like building a company, like there's a real fullness of a team there, hundreds of employees, things like that. They need to think about where's the right place to be. But it's interesting. Like one of our teams is just getting up to 100 people, and they're split between DC and Seattle. And you wouldn't necessarily think of those as like super startup hubs, but the talent they need are in those two cities. So I don't think it necessarily has to be like coastal elite startup hub cities, but I do think you need to constantly be thinking about where is your company going to thrive in terms of what it needs. If it needs to be near its customers, if it needs a certain talent pool, like what does that look like?
The other thing also is the world has become increasingly smaller thanks to the internet, and I think the pandemic actually helped in this regard, where online meetings are far more common, so you can talk to customers, talk to people, and then you can meet them in person pretty easily and pretty often as well. There's many reasons. I mean, I can't remember if I told you this story, but we were trying to hire this microelectronics engineer out of Boston. And I would make trips out to Boston for a variety of reasons, but specifically we really just wanted this guy because he was probably one of the dozen people in the world who could build the type of ASICs we needed. And I'd be like, yeah, I happen to be in town. I'd love to grab coffee. And we would just hang out for a couple hours. He'd take me to his lab and so on. So anyways, great founders are really resourceful in doing hustle things like that, whether that be for great employees, teammates that they want to bring on to their mission, all the way to finding investors, customers, whoever it might be.
How do you guys put parameters around culture fit?
Culture fit within 1517 or within someone's own company?
Within someone's company, like in general. I think that's one of the things I didn't have an appreciation for, where we've talked about like, certain like I had models for the types of people that I thought I needed on my team to internalize a certain set of context. And I realized that, the culture where that type of person came from was not exactly going to fit inside of my organizational structure and like be accustomed to the norms of working at a startup of our stage.
Sure.
Like, a high fidelity example be, say, someone like with a PhD who's 20 years my senior is not going to be happy coming into the 20 something run seed stage venture company. And so for you guys working with early stage startups that are like making those decisions about first hires and people to bring on, how do you help them think about what types of people both have like for me, my order goes integrity, loyalty, and competence, probably in that order. And I'm asking you guys for a similar heuristic in terms of like, as you talk to founders, the types of things to help them make decisions about who to work with.
Okay. There's a lot of thoughts about this, actually. One, it's like, what do you want to bring this person on for? And sometimes you just need somebody to solve a particular problem and then get out the way. And maybe it makes sense to bring this person on as a contractor. That's completely fine. But then you just have to be mindful whenever you're making a competence hire, how they will impact rest of the team, culture, motivation. And especially when your team is small. I did flight school when I was younger. And one of the things they would teach us in in sort of flight navigation is, this is aging myself. A lot of this stuff is automated now. But when you take off, and even if you're off by a degree, you will end up hundreds of kilometers away from where you're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And culture is very similar.
Mm.
So if the smaller your team, if somebody doesn't fit in the culture, it can really deviate where you want to go. And ultimately, it all starts with the founder, and you inevitably, knowingly or unknowingly, are responsible for culture. The other tactical thing that we did that paid really good dividends is we brought people on as advisors, or maybe sometimes as like part-time consultants to just help us with specific parts of the project. But we were also watching out for how did they interact with the team. We would do a lot of unstructured playtime when we were building our company. So we typically had broken the interview process into 3 parts. First was just like a personality fit. Are these the types of people we like being around? Do they have like the right skills, at least, based on what they're saying? The second part is technical, where it's like they start working with the team. And the third, we used to do these things called team huddles. Every 2 weeks, we would do a huddle, meaning somebody on the team would organize like a fun activity. It could be, we would have like anywhere from like a paper airplane flying competition. So we'd all be like fervorously putting together paper airplanes, and whoever would fly the longest would win, all the way to playing board games or playing soccer or whatever. We had rotated who was the huddle master. Anyways, we would invite this person to one of our huddles so that we could see them not just as like an engineer or like an ops person or whatever role we're hiring for, but as a person, and see how they work with the rest of us. And like, are they having fun? Because if you're building something so hard and you're going to be working crazy hours, you're going to be thinking day in, day out, you want to like the people you're around. So yeah, those are some of the tactical things that we did. But I don't have like here are the specific traits you look for. I think that depends on you, the founder, and you, the company.
I was going to add that one thing I think anyone in leadership doesn't do enough is really define their values on a granular level. So like, for example, you mentioned loyalty is really important, but it's like really hard to test for that, especially when you're getting to know somebody. So what I often talk with people about is like, can you get to a more granular level of like, what are the behaviors that you would look for out of somebody who has those types of traits? And even just front loading conversations with potential new team members, like, loyalty at our company means staying until this time at night, or like being excited to get here before the day technically begins, or like whatever it is, but like actually setting the expectation really, really clearly. Sometimes talking about these things takes me back to my charter school days, because I founded a charter school and it's been going for 16 years now. And I remember talking to this guy who also built charter schools, and we had hired our team of like, it was about 13 or 14. And we actually had to let go of, I think, 3/4 of the team after the first year. It was like very clear that it wasn't really working out. And as much as people, I think, wanted to sort of embody the values we had at the school, it was still hard for people to do it. And we would tell teachers like, hey, this is like, each classroom is like a startup, and like, you're really doing your own thing and you're really responsible and you've got to take the helm. And sure enough, it'd be like, oh, the day ends at 4. Okay, I'm out. I got to go now. We're like, what? Like, we told you this was a startup. Didn't really matter. But I was talking to this other charter school leader, and he says, my God, when people come and interview with me, I ask them how much pain and suffering do they want? And I was like, I like it. Like, yeah, like, why would they sign up for pain and suffering? And I always loved that particular frame because it was just very blunt. Like, you are signing up for pain and suffering if you join this, like that, no bones about it. So given that as our baseline, why do you want to be here? And it would just start really interesting conversations with people. And we ask founders this now of like, of all the things you could spend a lot of pain and suffering on, why this thing? So I think it's important for founders to really set the expectation, but the expectation isn't in the name of the value. It's in what those values look like as per behavior. So I just always recommend founders to like try to really sit down and write out like, what does loyalty actually look like in behavior, and not just as this like
Abstract
airy,
concept.
abstract concept. Yeah.
What is something that you learned from being a teacher, being involved in education in general, that gave you an edge in venture capital?
I think there's I mean, one thing that's interesting about teaching is that you are constantly sort of doing assessing of talent in some regard of like, okay, this person's like really good in these sort of arenas, and how do you help bring that out more for them? How do you maybe give them feedback to maybe like put a damper on some things that might not be working? Like, this is part of being a good educator. I also think there's a lot in terms of being an educator also means being an operator. Like, you're juggling a lot of different things. And one thing that I've seen in the venture world is lots of people really enjoy starting a fund. It's like, all right, I got one fund. This is really exciting. I'm tweeting. I'm like, this is, and I'm clearly on my laptop. I clearly don't do this as much since I'm not thumbing my tweets. Try to keep social media off my phone. But they like the like, oh, I'm going to be like, they like the fun part of the work. They like the being with people. They like the tweeting. They like the potential public persona-ness of it. And then what I've noticed over time is as people get into like fund 2 and beyond, oftentimes the team that kind of was the like, we're having fun getting this started team kind of fades out. And, oh yes, I'm handing this off to so-and-so or this team now. And I'm like, okay, there's something to that where I think people don't understand the operational component of running a fund, and you have to be organized and on top of things and send out reports and do audits, which are boring, and things like that. And so I think like the ability to like really be with people, but also just like do the boring stuff has really come in handy. And as a teacher, you're doing both of those things all the time.
If you were a teacher now, and you were like, situated in the context of like raising young people to contend with the world as it is, but not being involved with the Thiel Fellowship or 1517, how would you be thinking about giving young people the mental tools, just from like an education perspective in the classroom? Either of you guys could answer this question. Giving young people the tools to contend with the world as it is, to have agency and do things.
Yeah, I mean, at Innovations Academy, I mean, this is happening, at our charter school all the time, is we think a lot about, we call it like student-led project-based learning, where it's looking at what are the interests, like going back to those passions of the students, and how do we embed those things in the work that we're doing in the classroom. We have a very, very strong social emotional curriculum at Innovations Academy. And it's interesting, when we started 16 years ago, no one knew what social emotional curriculum was. Like, in fact, our 7th and 8th graders used to call it so emo time. They're like, why do you make us do so emo? And it was just like, yeah, every day, you were doing some journaling or doing some reflecting on something and sharing with the classroom about what you're thinking about. And now it's really fascinating. We run a camp for 1517 now that we've run 2 years in a row. And it's interesting when you get to see change over time, because as someone who was in education and has worked with young people for a long time, I can see the difference that all these young people who come to our camp, social emotional curriculum is now in like many schools. And I don't necessarily agree with the way it's always done, but it's definitely making a positive dent, because I see the way that these young people like converse and even argue with each other, and it's so mature. Like, I even had to laugh at myself at one point because I was like very disagreeing with one of our campers on something, but another camper like disagreed in a way nicer way than I did. And I was like, oh man, that social emotional curriculum, that really works. Like, so things like project-based learning and social emotional curriculum, I think, are really helpful in and I think children, okay, here's the thing. I think children naturally have agency and passion in all these things. I think what happens is the system just covers it up. It just squashes it.
I'm
Yes.
100% with you.
So yeah.
The conventional like terminology of, waking up at some point later in your life, I think is incorrect. You are by default awake.
Yeah.
And
You just
exactly
got
what you're
buried
saying.
in bullshit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think a lot of it is just like, okay, if you don't bury people and stuff, then they retain what they already had. And, I don't think a teacher needs to teach someone how to be motivated, for example. It's like, I'll never forget this tweet over the pandemic. Someone was like, oh, my brother was so bored that he played guitar all the time. And I was like, oh my God, that's not boredom. That's motivation. That's what it looks like when a person is just like, yeah, I got to do this thing. So I think a lot of what would also make education better going into the future is really if people thought of a classroom like a facilitation space instead of I'm going to educate you. It's like, hey, what if we just don't layer on all this stuff that weighs you down and give you a, going back to play and the sandbox. What if we give you a sandbox with resources and experiences to help you bring out more of who you're supposed to be? And it's really hard to do that if the curriculum is, hey, open this book. We're going to do this today. I think those types of experiences are easier to host if it's in like a project-based learning environment and if it's in an environment that has a social emotional curriculum.
Yeah. The worst thing I feel like you could do to somebody is if somebody comes to you and is like, I'm passionate about plant biology. The worst thing you can do is like, here's a textbook, go read it.
Oh, yeah.
Instead, it's like, yeah, grow a plant. See where that goes.
Yeah.
What works? What didn't
Right.
work?
What light conditions worked?
Yeah.
Let's overwater it. Let's underwater it. Let's see what happens.
Yeah. And I you've met my dad, so you know a little bit about this, but I was really fortunate. My dad he was a lecturer in India. He was and he would teach. So because he was an insider in the system, he realized how full of BS it was. So he would do this thing where when we were growing up, and he'd take a day off from time to time, and he'd be like, "Hey Harry, you wanna not go to school today?"
Nice.
And I'm like, yeah. So we'll just go around. We grew up in Toronto, so we'll just take the like local transit and just go around the city and explore things and like play chess on the street or like go to a museum or alleyway or whatever. We would just be exploring. And that's some of the fondest parts of my childhood is when I was just exploring.
What are you exploring these days?
Oh man. So many things, but I'll talk about two. First is this problem of science stagnation. I think this is probably one of the biggest detriments to push humanity to the next stage. Is there's far too much BS research, and that gets lauded, whereas I think we should be backing these renegade scientists far more. And 1517 helps me do that. The other part that's that I think a lot more about is something called wisdom cultivation. So, one of the biggest problems I see in society now is we're manufacturing zombies, robots, and plastics, all the while using human beings as the raw ingredient. And it goes back to something Danielle said, which is this, we start with agency and then we take that away. Education is just one institution taking that away, but there's so many that do this. And we make these people into zombies. Zombies are those of us that are, will end up spending 8, 9, 10 hours a day doing something we don't like, so that we could go home and scroll some more on our phone.
Mm.
The robots are those of us that are looked upon purely as units of production and nothing more, where it's like, I'm optimizing so I can produce more. And then you take the Socratic question to the next level, and like, why? What do you want to gain at the end of this? Like, and they're blank. It's like, oh my God, I'm just producing for the sake of producing. And then plastics are those of us that, think of like the TikTok influencer, or, maybe a disingenuous politician or a disingenuous lawyer or what have you, who appears a particular way, shiny on the outside, but on the inside is something very, very different. And this is, again, this idea of liberation that doesn't get to each and every one of these three categories. Whereas to me, to be human is to be liberated.
Mm.
And so you're interested in cultivating wisdom and giving people the tools to exit one of those negative states.
That's right.
What are some of the tools, if any, that you've come across so far that you would put forward?
Oh man. Okay. This can go on for some while. Look, okay. There's many tactics, but I think the biggest thing, if you're in search of meaning and you can't really pinpoint it for yourself, I think the biggest thing I can say to a listener is just be reflective. Spend some time crawling through the inner working of your mind. Explore the nooks and crannies and see what you discover. And I think because we live in such a consumptive world, and I just don't mean like physical things, we're constantly consuming information or constantly consuming experiences. To me, there's beauty in boredom. It's like, I quite like that tweet that you were talking about. It's like boredom leads to this magic where it's like, oh, I'll go learn to play the guitar in your example, or I'll discover some obscure part of the world or obscure science theory that I now want to go explore. So yeah, I'll actually go on the other side and say, I want more people to be bored exploring themselves and the world around them. And there's this active way of doing that. And I think far too many of us are living this sort of sedated lifestyle that prevents us from that.
All right, I'm going to ask my last question. Since you guys have both recently gotten in St. Louis, it's probably our coldest day this year, and you might be hungry. So this is the Peter Thiel paradox, so hopefully you have an answer for it. What is something that you believe to be true that the rest of the world is overlooking or denying?
I've got a couple of things that come to mind. I have one that is sort of my silly one, but I'm like, I will die on this horse, which is the big pillow thing. Yeah. Yeah. I don't remember the name of this author, but there's an author who's done a lot of research on that. Basically, sitting on squishy stuff, pillows, couches, things like that are really killing our bodies. And yeah, for 15 years, I have slept, either with like a, very thin t-shirts or a very thin pillow, or no pillow at all. I actually mostly sleep without. And it's one of these things where, I think it's going to catch on at some point of like, all right, my contrarian take, everyone should get rid of their pillows. There's a new one that I've been kind of thinking about lately, which is one of I'm not really a big New Year's resolution person, but to Harry's point about being reflective, I like to take the time to be really reflective and think about like, okay, what do I want going into 2025? And this also hits on Harry's point about sort of like, you didn't use a phrase like toxic productivity, but sort of going in that direction of, for a long time, I've been someone who like maximizes on time and time efficiency and things like that. And I don't know if that it's like a contrarian take, but I think that people should be much more thoughtful about managing their energy at least at a certain point, maybe in their life, than their time. And I've made these like really small tweaks, and this has just started in January, that have made a huge difference. Like, and it sounds silly. Like there's always like the profundity of the thing that you're doing in the moment, but when you say it out loud, you're like, okay, that sounds dumb. But like one example is we travel a lot for 15, 17, and normally I'm like, all right, first flight out, 7 or 8 a.m. flight, because, if there are delays, I won't be as delayed getting somewhere, or it's just more efficient somehow, or I can pack in another meeting or whatever it is. But it also means I'm underslept. And like, it just gets me on a bad trajectory. So in the last few weeks, I've been like, all right, I'm going to take a flight that's at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. And like, it's a world of difference. I like go somewhere and I'm not drained. And, I get on a better rhythm with where I'm going. And I also don't feel spent when I get, like, I don't feel like, oh God, I have to get home so I can like sort of recover from the travel. I'm just like doing well. So like my newer sort of, again, I don't know if it's a contrarian take, is that people need to think about managing their energy as much, if not more, as managing their time.
I like that one.
Yeah, I also have a few, and I'm trying to figure out which one I tell you. Okay, I'll give you the more woo-woo crazy one.
Ooh.
Nice.
I think there exists higher dimensions that we as humans can tap into. We just haven't figured it out yet. In my mind, there's also ways that this works with the simulation theory or simulation hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll save that for a different day. But I just believe that there's higher dimensions that, we have access to, but we've lost our way finding it.
Can I add to that, Harry?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is I'm like getting to a point of almost like aggravation with this, because I'm like, not only do I believe what you said, it's like, it's just true. And the thing that has been coming up for me so much in recent years is like, we just all talk too much.
Yeah.
Like, the verbal plane is one plane, and we are very much missing out on the nonverbal plane, on the physical plane, on the spiritual plane, on these other areas of human development that we don't even understand or know about. But yeah, I've been on this, like, we all talk too much. Like,
and
we all
language
need
itself,
to be quiet. Get
language
bored and be quiet.
Yeah, and language itself is very, very limiting in this sense, because it doesn't do it justice to explain the experience. And it's this empty symbol.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I say anger or when I say love, you might go into your Byzantine conduit of what love means, or memories of love or anger that you might have had. But how do I know that you're saying the same thing that I am? Or because we've just had fundamentally different experiences. So yes, amen to talking less.
I almost wish I didn't put a pin in the conversation, because there's so much more to explore there. But as you said, we'll leave it for another day. I am grateful to be creating value for both of you guys. Whenever you said that, you got that check from Peter and it was like, wow, we got it and we were energized and we got like the best possible lead. I feel that way about both Long Journey and you guys. I really feel like I lucked out. And so thank you both for coming to St. Louis to see what we have going on here. And thank you for joining me for this weird conversational experiment with one of your portfolio companies.
Oh, I loved it.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.